Hello beautiful people. Welcome to No Harry. In today's episode, we explore, what if Veela Queen sensed 38 compulsion charms on Harry age 9 and brought international tribunal against Dumbledore. Hit like, subscribe, and join our community of story lovers. Let's begin. Chapter 1, The Scent of Chains. The Ministry of Magic's visitor entrance on a Tuesday afternoon smelled like damp wool and bureaucratic anxiety, which was to say it smelled like every other Tuesday afternoon. The phone box rattled as it descended, and Apolline Delacour stood perfectly still inside it while the walls slid past her, one hand resting lightly on her daughter's shoulder, the other holding a slim leather attaché case that contained, among other things, 3 diplomatic seals, a translation charm matrix, and a very small jar of her preferred tea. She had learned, in 11 years of representing the French magical attaché's office in cross-continental negotiations, that you could tell everything about an institution by the way it made you enter. The British ministry made everyone enter through a battered red phone box in the middle of a London street, gave them a badge that described their purpose in the most reductive terms possible, Apolline Delacour, foreign dignitary, and then deposited them into an atrium that was, admittedly, quite beautiful, but beautiful in the way of a place that knew it was being looked at. "Maman," said Fleur, who was 11 and therefore had opinions about everything, "this badge says I am a dependent." "I see that. I am not a dependent. I am accompanying you in an official observational capacity. You told me you wanted to see the gargoyles. I can want to see the gargoyles and resent the categorization." Apolline didn't smile, but it was a near thing. Fleur had her father's precision and her mother's refusal to accept the world as it was presented. It was occasionally exhausting and mostly wonderful. The atrium opened around them, the golden fountain, the fireplaces blazing green along the far wall, the shuffle and murmur of several hundred magical bureaucrats going about the business of governing Britain's wizarding world. The reception function was already underway in the East Hall, which Apolline knew because she could hear the particular pitch of diplomatic small talk through the open double doors, that specific frequency of people saying important-sounding things that meant nothing while circling the people they actually needed to speak to. She collected their proper visitor passes from the security desk, a wand registration that she submitted to with professional patience, and guided Fleur toward the East Hall. The afternoon's agenda was straightforward. A reception hosted by the Department of International Magical Cooperation to celebrate some new trade agreement regarding imported flobberworm derivatives, which Apolline had absolutely no professional investment in but which provided the cover she needed to speak privately with Bartemius Crouch about the cross-border portkey licensing issue that had been dragging on for 4 months. It was going to be a perfectly ordinary Tuesday. She noticed the boy the moment she stepped through the East Hall doors. That wasn't quite right. She sensed him, and then noticed him because of what she sensed, the way you might hear a wrong note in a familiar song and then look up to find the musician. He was standing near the far wall beside a woman who had the posture of someone who would rather be anywhere else, and he was small for his age, whichever age that was, dressed in clothes that were slightly too large in the way of hand-me-downs rather than fashion. Dark hair that had given up any pretense of direction. Glasses that sat a little crooked on his face. He was perhaps 9 years old. And he was absolutely covered. Apolline stopped walking. "Maman?" Fleur had taken 2 more steps before realizing her mother had gone still. She turned back, reading her mother's face with the quickness of a child who had grown up learning to read subtle signals. "What is it?" Apolline didn't answer immediately because she was counting. Veela's sense for compulsion magic was not something she could turn off. It was as constant and involuntary as breathing, a low-level awareness of ambient magical intent that most of the time registered as background noise, a warming charm here, a mild confidence boost there, the ordinary small enchantments people carried without thinking. Walking through a crowd was like walking through a field of different colored lights, most of them dim, most of them benign. The boy across the room was not a light. He was a system. A lattice of interlocking compulsion work laid so carefully over years that the individual charms had started to grow together at the edges, reinforcing each other, each one leaning on the next like stones in an arch. She had never, in 34 years of living and 15 years of professional diplomatic work, felt anything like it on a human being. She counted. She made herself be methodical about it rather than reactive, because the reactive response was building at the base of her throat in the form of something between fury and horror, and neither would serve her. 37. 38. 38 compulsion charms on a child who was 9 years old. Some of them were old. The oldest ones, she could feel their texture from here, and texture was the only word she had for it, the way different magical workings had different feelings, the way different fabrics had different weights. The oldest ones had been laid when he was very small. Perhaps as young as 1 year old. Perhaps younger. They had the soft, worn quality of workings that had been in place so long they'd become structural, load-bearing, part of the architecture of how his magic had grown around them. The most recent one was perhaps 6 months old. Fleur, said Apolline, in French, her voice entirely level, I need you to stay close to me. Do not go anywhere without telling me first. Fleur, to her credit, didn't argue. She simply moved to her mother's side and said, also in French, what's wrong? I'm not certain yet. A lie by omission. She was very certain what was wrong. What she wasn't certain of was who had done it, and, this was the part that made her chest go cold, whether the people in this room knew. Do you see the boy by the far wall? Dark hair, glasses, green eyes. Fleur looked. Yes. He looks uncomfortable. I want you to notice him without looking at him. Can you do that? Of course. A pause. He keeps looking at the door. Apolline had noticed that too. The woman beside him, a ministry employee of some kind, she guessed, from the badge, was ignoring him almost completely, which was an interesting choice when you were responsible for a 9-year-old at a diplomatic function. The boy was present the way furniture was present. Like everyone around him had agreed, perhaps without ever consciously discussing it, that he didn't require acknowledgement. She crossed the room. She was aware of eyes following her as she moved, they generally did, and she had long since stopped caring, but her attention was entirely on the boy and the way the compulsion lattice felt as she got closer. Denser. More specific. As she got within 10 feet of him she could start to pick out individual threads, and what she could read of their intent made the coldness in her chest spread outward. Don't question authority. Don't seek attention. Don't display unusual ability. Trust the right people. Don't trust the wrong ones. Those were the broad strokes. The fine work was more specific, more targeted, calibrated to a particular life and a particular set of fears. This had been designed. Not slapped together, not the work of a single frightened afternoon. This was architecture. This was craft. This was someone who had sat down and thought carefully about how to shape a child. Hello, she said. The boy looked up. He had very green eyes, the kind of green that was unusual enough to be memorable, and they were currently doing the specific thing eyes did when someone unexpected paid you direct attention and you weren't sure whether to be pleased or alarmed. He looked at her the way small animals looked at larger ones, assessing, uncertain, ready. Hello, he said, in the careful, slightly formal way of a child who had learned to be polite as a survival strategy rather than a social one. I don't believe I know your name, Apolline said. She kept her voice easy, warm, the tone she used when she wanted someone to forget they were in a formal setting. I'm Apolline Delacour. I'm visiting from France. Something flickered across his face, recognition, quickly suppressed. He knew the name, then, or knew of it. Harry, he said. Harry Potter. She had suspected. The scar was visible at his hairline, a precise lightning bolt that was, itself, interesting from a curse-word perspective, and she filed that observation away for later. This is my daughter, Fleur. Fleur, to Apolline's private amusement, was examining Harry Potter with the expression she used on things she hadn't decided how to categorize yet. You look like you'd rather not be here, Fleur said, in English that carried only a slight accent. It wasn't an insult. It was an observation. Harry blinked at her. Is it that obvious? A little, Fleur said. Why are you here? I'm not entirely sure, Harry said, and there was something almost rueful about it, like he'd been asking himself the same question. Mrs. Figg, she's a neighbor, she usually watches me when my aunt and uncle can't, but she broke her ankle last week, and the ministry sent a letter saying I had to attend, so. He stopped, like he'd said too much. That was interesting. A mandatory summons for a 9-year-old to a trade reception wasn't standard. Someone had arranged this. Apolline kept her expression pleasantly neutral and stored that information with the rest of it. What do you make of it so far? She asked. The fountain's nice, Harry said. And someone's got very small sandwiches on that table over there which I've been thinking about for about 20 minutes. He paused again, like he was doing the calculation of whether that was an appropriate thing to say to a foreign dignitary, and apparently decided it was too late. Sorry. Don't apologize, Apolline said. Diplomatic receptions have terrible food. This is a universal truth. She glanced at Fleur. Take him to the sandwiches. I'll find you in a few minutes. Fleur looked like she had about 6 opinions about being delegated the task of feeding a strange boy at a ministry reception, but she also seemed to recognize, with the instinct of a child raised in proximity to politics, that her mother needed a moment. Come on, then, she said to Harry, in a tone that was bossy only in the sense that it expected to be followed. Before the ministry people eat them all. They look hungry in a very particular way. Harry, somewhat to Apolline's amusement, followed without apparent question, the two of them threading through the crowd toward the refreshments table. She watched them go for a moment, the pale girl with the silver hair already talking, the dark-haired boy listening with the kind of attention he gave everything, like he was still deciding whether to believe in what was in front of him. Then she turned and found Bartemius Crouch. Not because she wanted to discuss portkey licensing. Because Bartemius Crouch was the senior British representative at this function, and she needed to look at him and know whether he knew. He was standing with a small cluster of officials near the center of the room. She crossed to him with the ease of someone who had been navigating these spaces for 15 years, accepted the glass of wine someone pressed into her hand without looking at it, and spent exactly 4 minutes exchanging the appropriate pleasantries before she said, at a natural transition in the conversation, I noticed young Mr. Potter is in attendance. Is that a regular occurrence? The shift in Crouch's expression was small but legible. A slight tightening around the eyes. A fraction of a pause before he said, the headmaster felt some exposure to the institutional side of the magical world would be beneficial. He has, of course, an unusual position in our community. Of course, said Apolline pleasantly. Is there a concern? Crouch asked, and the question was careful in the way of a man who was hoping there wasn't one but had already started calculating what to do if there was. Not at all, Apolline said. He seems like a lovely child. I was simply curious. She excused herself shortly after and found a quiet corner of the hall where she could see both the refreshments table, where Fleur appeared to be explaining something to Harry with great conviction, using a small sandwich as a prop, and the cluster of officials where Crouch was now talking more quickly than he had been before. She opened her attaché case and took out a small piece of parchment and a self-inking quill, and she began to write. Not a formal filing, that would come later, tonight, from her hotel room, through proper channels. This was a note to herself, a record of time and place and the exact nature of what she had sensed, written in the precise professional language of a magical consultant who knew that this document might someday be read in a courtroom. Ministry of Magic, London. Tuesday, November 14, 1989, approximately 14:30 hours. Subject, Harry James Potter, male, age approximately 9. Detection of compulsion workings, 38 individual charms of varying age and complexity, layered in an interlocking lattice consistent with long-term deliberate application. Oldest detectable workings estimated 8 years of age or older. Specific intent signatures noted, suppression of autonomous magical expression, authority compliance conditioning, social isolation reinforcement, trust direction, and at least 3 workings whose intent I could not fully characterize on brief examination but which carry the signature weight of long-term behavioral shaping. Note, some charms carry a distinctive aesthetic signature that is consistent with a high-level practitioner of considerable experience and artistry. Note, subject is unaware of the existence of these workings. She stopped. Read it back. Then she wrote at the bottom, note, subject smiled at a joke my daughter made about ministry sandwiches. He has not smiled since. She capped the quill, folded the parchment, and placed it in the interior pocket of her case, and then she walked to the refreshments table to collect her daughter and the boy who had 38 chains around his heart that he didn't know were there. He didn't know what to make of Fleur Delacour. Most of the adults Harry had met in his life fell into clear categories: ones who ignored him, ones who were vaguely suspicious of him, ones who were aggressively nice to him in a way that felt like a performance, and his aunt and uncle, who were a category all their own. Fleur was none of these things, and she was also not an adult, which complicated the taxonomy further. She was 11 and she acted like 11 was approximately 45 in terms of how seriously she expected to be taken. She had explained to him, in the first 3 minutes of their acquaintance, that the sandwiches were arranged in an unnecessarily complicated pattern because whoever had organized the table was compensating for insecurity, that the wine being served was a full vintage below what you'd expect at a function of this supposed importance, and that the man near the potted plant was definitely listening to the conversation happening 6 feet away from him while pretending to read a pamphlet. Is he? Harry had looked. Don't look, Fleur said immediately. Obviously. Sorry. He'd looked back at the sandwiches. How do you know? His pamphlet is upside down and he has been on the same page for 4 minutes. She handed him a sandwich, cucumber, it turned out, and not actually very good, and said, "You are Harry Potter." Yes. I thought you would be different. He was not entirely sure how to take that. Different how? She considered it with the seriousness of someone completing a calculation. I don't know yet. She took a sandwich for herself and ate it with the efficiency of someone who had already judged it and found it wanting but was eating anyway because they were hungry. Why are you here? You don't like it. You're the second person to ask me that in 10 minutes. My mother also asked. She notices things. She seems like she does, Harry agreed. He glanced toward the woman across the room, who was talking to a small group of officials with the particular quality of someone who was listening more than they were speaking. There was something about her that made the room feel slightly different in the radius around her, like the light was somehow more or less something near her than it was elsewhere. He couldn't have said what it was. What is she doing here? International magical cooperation. She is very good at it. Fleur said this with the pride and slight resignation of someone who knew that their parent was extraordinary and was still working on how to feel about that. She negotiates things. And she senses things. Veela can sense magical workings on people. Harry absorbed this. What kinds of workings? Fleur looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Enchantments. Compulsion charms. Things people put on other people to make them behave in certain ways. She paused. Why? No reason, Harry said. It wasn't entirely a lie. He had no specific reason. He just had a persistent and low-grade awareness, which he had never articulated to anyone because he had no language for it and also because articulating unusual things generally led to unpleasant outcomes, that something about how he moved through the world felt slightly like wearing someone else's shoes. Not painful exactly. Just, off. Like a background noise you'd heard for so long you'd stopped noticing it but couldn't quite stop hearing either. She sensed something on you, Fleur said. He looked at her. She was watching him with the directness of someone who had decided honesty was more efficient than circumspection. Did she? He said, and it didn't come out as a question. I think so. That's why she sent me with you. She considered him for another moment. You're not frightened. Should I be? Most people would be. Most people probably know more about what's happening than I do, Harry pointed out. Fleur almost smiled. It was a small, quick thing, like a door opening a fraction and then reconsidering. That is fair, she said. I don't know either. My mother will tell us what she decides. How do you know she'll tell us? She doesn't know me. She will tell me, Fleur said, as if this were obvious, and I am telling you, so it comes out the same. She looked at the man near the potted plant, who had finally turned his pamphlet right side up and was now leaving with the specific haste of someone pretending they'd never been there. What do you know about compulsion charms? Not much, Harry said. I've only had magic lessons for, he stopped. 4. I'm not supposed to have had any yet, he said carefully. Formally. I'm not 11. Fleur glanced at him with renewed assessment. But informally. He thought about the burned patches on his bedroom wall that he'd covered with his too large clothes, and the way the lock on his cupboard had come undone twice in the night when things were very bad, and the time he'd been running from Dudley's gang and had somehow ended up on the school roof. Things happen, he said. Yes, Fleur agreed, like this was entirely sensible. Things happen to me too. My mother says it is because we have more magic than we know what to do with and it finds exits. He started. That's actually a very good way of describing it. Fleur looked pleased in the way of someone who heard confirmation of their mother's wisdom and felt vindicated by it. Compulsion charms, she said, returning to the subject with the focus of someone who did not leave threads hanging, are illegal in France. In Britain they are legal with consent, which is obviously absurd if the person being charmed is a child because a child cannot consent to having their behavior shaped. Harry was quiet for a moment. How many can she sense at a time, he asked. She didn't say exactly. Fleur looked at him steadily. She stopped walking when she saw you. He had seen that. He'd noticed a woman stop moving in a crowded room and look at him like he was something specific rather than something background, and the feeling it had produced was strange, not comfortable, not uncomfortable, but pointed. The feeling of being seen by someone who was actually looking. Are you scared? Fleur asked. I told you I wasn't. That was 30 seconds ago, she said. Things change. He thought about it honestly. He thought about the persistent low-grade sense of borrowed shoes. He thought about the way certain things, certain impulses toward particular people or away from particular choices, had always felt slightly external, like suggestions that came with unusual weight. He thought about the way he sometimes surprised himself, which was the wrong way around, because you shouldn't be able to surprise yourself, should you? That should be the one area where you had advance notice. No, he said. Is that wrong? I don't think so, Fleur said. I think it means you already knew something was wrong, and being told is less frightening than not knowing. He looked at her. What? She said. You're 11. Yes. And? He couldn't quite formulate what he'd meant to say, which was something like, you talk like someone who's thought about things properly, which is unusual, and I'm not sure whether to find it reassuring or overwhelming. Nothing, he said instead. Thank you for the sandwich. It was terrible, Fleur agreed. You're welcome. The hotel Apolline had booked for the duration of the London visit was a magical establishment near Charing Cross, small, quiet, and staffed by people who understood that foreign diplomatic visitors sometimes had unusual hours and unusual needs. Fleur was asleep in the connecting room by 9, or possibly awake pretending to be asleep, which amounted to the same practical result. Apolline sat at the writing desk with her diplomatic seal set out before her, the formal parchment of the International Confederation of Wizards weighted flat at the corners by 2 small candle holders, and she wrote. She had been composing this document in her head since the moment she'd left the ministry, during the walk back, during dinner, during the careful conversation she'd had with Fleur about what she'd sensed and what she was going to do about it. She knew exactly what it needed to say and she wrote it without stopping, the formal language of an ICW complaint coming to her with the ease of something she'd practiced, because she had, though never for anything like this. The document named Harry James Potter, age 9, British national, as the subject of sustained magical manipulation in the form of 38 documented compulsion charms of varying age and complexity. It named the nature of the enchantments as specifically identified by a Veela practitioner of record, which was a legally recognized category of magical expert witness under Article 14 of the ICW's Magical Persons Protection Accords, accords that Britain had signed in 1963 and never repealed, which Apolline knew because she had checked, twice, in the last 4 hours. The document requested an emergency tribunal under Article 7 of those same accords, which allowed for accelerated proceedings when a minor was the subject of ongoing magical harm. It requested immediate independent examination of the subject by certified curse-breakers of neutral national origin. It requested the temporary involvement of the ICW's Magical Child Protection Division. And then it named Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore, Order of Merlin First Class, Chief Warlock of the Wizengamot, Supreme Mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards. She listed every title with precise intention, because every title was also a responsibility, and naming them all was the document's way of saying he knew better. As the primary individual whose enchantment signature she had identified in the latticework covering Harry Potter. She did not name him as the only architect. She was careful about that, because she was not certain, and documents like this could not afford uncertainty presented as fact. But she named him as the primary one. Because he was. She had recognized the signature. 15 years of diplomatic work had brought her into contact with many of the most skilled magical practitioners in the world, and Dumbledore was one of the most distinctive. His magical aesthetic was like a fingerprint, a particular elegance, a tendency toward layered intent, a craftsmanship that was almost artistic in its precision. She had sensed it twice before, once at an ICW conference where he'd erected a broad protective ward over the attendees, and once in a cursed object she'd been asked to assess that had passed through a collector who'd gotten it from Britain. Looking at the lattice of charms over Harry Potter and not seeing Dumbledore's signature would have been like looking at a painting and not seeing the artist's style. She saw it. She was sure. She sealed the document with 3 of her official seals, personal, professional, and diplomatic, and she sat back and looked at it for a long moment. She was aware of what she was doing. She was filing a formal magical misconduct complaint against the most celebrated wizard in the world, in his home country, in a system that he effectively ran. She was doing this based on a single detection at a diplomatic function, with nothing yet but her own sensory identification to support the claim. She was doing it in a country that had every reason to close ranks, with institutions that had every incentive to protect their own. She thought about the boy's face when she'd said hello. The assessment, the uncertainty, the readiness. The way he'd smiled at her daughter's joke about sandwiches, that quick, real smile that was gone so fast it might have been imagined, like a candle flame in wind. She thought about the oldest charms in the lattice, the ones laid so long ago they'd grown into the structure of his magic the way bone grew around old fractures. She thought about the specific intent she'd read in the architecture of it: don't seek attention, don't display unusual ability, trust the right people, don't trust the wrong ones. Don't trust the wrong ones. Calibrated to a specific list of wrong ones that she was increasingly confident had been chosen by the same person who'd laid the charm. She picked up the document and folded it into the diplomatic envelope. Then she picked up a second piece of parchment and wrote a shorter, private letter to a colleague in Geneva, a woman named Hestia Papadopoulos who ran the ICW's Magical Child Protection Division and who Apolline trusted, specifically, because Hestia had spent 20 years doing a job that everyone recognized as important and nobody wanted, and people who did jobs like that for 20 years either became very corrupt or very incorruptible, and Hestia was the second kind. Hestia, I'm filing tomorrow morning through official channels. You will recognize the name of the subject. You will also recognize the name I'm placing in the document. I need this to move quickly and I need it to be airtight. Meet me in London at the earliest opportunity. She sealed that one too. Then she sat very still for a moment, in the quiet hotel room with the sounds of London muffled by whatever wards were on the building, and she allowed herself 20 seconds of the feeling she'd been keeping contained since 2:30 in the afternoon, the cold, clean fury of someone who had seen something that should not exist, built by someone who had known exactly what they were building. 20 seconds. Then she folded it up, put it away, and began preparing her arguments. In the morning, she found Harry Potter standing outside the hotel. She had not told him where she was staying. She had not given him any means of finding her. She stopped in the hotel doorway and looked at him standing on the pavement in the grey November morning in his too large coat, and he looked back at her with the careful, assessing expression she was already coming to recognize as his default. "How did you find me?" she asked. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I woke up and I knew where to walk." She considered this. A 9-year-old, operating in a magical city he'd presumably never been allowed to navigate alone, finding a specific hotel through what amounted to raw instinct. She noted it. She noted also that his left shoe was untied and there was a bruise on his wrist that disappeared under the cuff of his coat, and she noted that with a different kind of feeling entirely. "Are you hungry?" she said. He blinked, like she'd offered something in a language he'd had to translate. "Yes," he said, and there was enough honesty in it that she suspected the answer was almost always yes. "Come in then," she said. "Fleur will want breakfast." He came in with the quiet, adaptive quality of a child who'd learned to move through spaces that weren't his without requiring them to adjust to his presence. She watched him take in the hotel lobby, the slightly unusual architecture, the staff who moved with more certainty than ordinary hotel staff usually did, the small telltales of magical reinforcement in the walls, and she watched the way his eyes caught all more actions. Right, the next chapter now. Chapter 2, The Architecture of Control. The ICW's preliminary hearing room in Geneva was not designed to be intimidating. That was, Apolline had always thought, precisely what made it so effective. The chamber was calm, wood-paneled, lit by high windows that let in a clean alpine light, furnished with the kind of understated quality that said we do not need to impress you in a tone that was somehow more authoritative than marble columns would have been. The ICW had been meeting in this room for 200 years, and it had absorbed all of that into its walls, every negotiation, every dispute, every time someone very important had been told, in very polite language, that they were wrong. She arrived 40 minutes early. She always arrived 40 minutes early. The delegation room assigned to her was small and sensible, and she set her materials out on the table in a precise order that she'd developed over 15 years, the ones she'd need first at the right hand, the ones she might not need at all but wanted accessible at the left, the ones she absolutely could not use in their current form in the middle, as a reminder. Hestia Papadopoulos arrived 20 minutes later with 2 junior colleagues, a stack of documents 2 inches thick, and the expression of a woman who had slept approximately 4 hours. "Tell me you have more than your sensory identification," Hestia said, by way of greeting. "Good morning, Hestia." "Good morning. Tell me you have more than your sensory identification." "I have a certified declaration from the examination yesterday." Apolline slid it across the table, the report from the 2 Gringotts cursebreakers she had arranged through the French ministry's emergency contacts, certified neutral examiners of record, who had spent 3 hours with Harry at the hotel while Fleur sat outside the examination room doing homework with the focused energy of someone channeling anxiety into productivity. They found 38 distinct workings. They catalogued 26 in full. The remaining 12 require more time for complete identification, which the preliminary hearing will need to account for. Hestia read the first 2 pages. Something moved across her face, the particular expression of a professional who had seen a great deal and still occasionally encountered something that reached through professional distance and grabbed. "The oldest one," she said. "They're saying it was placed when he was approximately 14 months old." "Yes. He was 14 months old when Voldemort, yes." Hestia set the report down and looked at Apolline directly. "You understand what we're walking into. I have been thinking of very little else for 5 days. Dumbledore's support in this institution is not incidental. He has been supreme mugwump for, I know his record, Hestia. I'm not talking about his record. I'm talking about the 11 sitting members of the senior tribunal panel who have, in the last decade, had personal professional correspondence with him. I'm talking about 3 of our senior adjudicators who completed their international certification under his sponsorship." Hestia's voice was not arguing against proceeding. Apolline knew her well enough to know she'd already decided to proceed. She was laying the landscape so they could navigate it. I'm talking about the fact that the man we're naming in this complaint is simultaneously one of the ICW's most prominent members, and the chief warlock of the body that would ordinarily adjudicate domestic British magical misconduct, which creates a conflict of interest labyrinth that will take us a month just to map. Which is why, Apolline said, we invoked Article 7 rather than domestic channels. The moment this became an international tribunal, the British Wisingamoth's jurisdiction was suspended on this specific matter. Fudge will challenge that within the week. Fudge can challenge it. He's welcome to. The Accords are the Accords. She paused. We need panel members with no prior professional relationship with Dumbledore. I have 3 names from the French delegation, 2 from the Scandinavian bloc, and Director Ahmadi from the Iranian ministry has indicated willingness to serve if asked. Hestia looked at her for a moment with an expression that was something between professional appreciation and personal sympathy. You've been building this since Tuesday. Since Tuesday afternoon, yes. And the boy? He's here. My husband came from Paris last night. He and Fleur are with Harry in the Delegate Hotel. She stopped. He asked me yesterday whether he'd be allowed to go back to his relatives after the examination. He asked it like going back was the outcome he expected and he was simply trying to prepare for it. Hestia was quiet. He has a bruise on his wrist that I have not yet been able to fully account for, Apolline said. Her voice was level. I am adding a welfare inquiry to the complaint documentation. That's going to expand the scope considerably. I know. It's the right thing to do. I know that too. Apolline picked up the first document from the right-hand stack. Shall we go over the panel selection? They worked for the next 2 hours with the focused, unhurried precision of people who understood that the fight they were entering would be won or lost on preparation, and preparation was the one variable they controlled. Harry had never been to Geneva before. He hadn't been much of anywhere before, which was something he was starting to understand was not standard. The Delacours, Henri, who was quiet and warm and had immediately upon meeting Harry offered him the kind of handshake you gave another person rather than the performance of politeness handshake adults usually gave children, had taken him and Fleur out into the city the afternoon before the hearing, and Harry had walked along the lake promenade with the Alps sitting enormous and white on the horizon and thought, I didn't know it looked like this. It wasn't a sad thought. It was just a noticing. Have you been many places? Fleur asked. They were sitting on a low wall near the lake while Henri bought something warm to drink from a vendor further along the promenade. No, Harry said. I haven't really been anywhere. Not even on holiday. He shook his head. He watched a boat moving slowly across the flat grey water. My relatives don't take me. Fleur was quiet for a moment. Do they know? She stopped, editing herself. Have they always been like that? As long as I can remember. He paused. I don't think they like me much. Why not? He'd thought about this before. Not with bitterness, particularly. Bitterness was an emotion he'd learned early required more energy than he usually had to spare, but with the matter-of-fact curiosity of someone cataloging a fact they didn't fully understand. I think I make them nervous, he said. Things happen around me sometimes. Magic things. He glanced at her. You said that happened to you too. Yes, but my family didn't mind it. My mother explained it to me when I was very young. A pause. She said the magic is always trying to tell you something, and your job is to learn the language. What does yours tell you? Fleur considered this with genuine seriousness. Usually that something needs attention that I'm not paying attention to, she said. Sometimes that I'm more frightened than I'm admitting. She looked at him sideways. What does yours say? He thought about it honestly. He thought about the lock on the cupboard. He thought about the school roof. He thought about the times when something had happened that he hadn't chosen or anticipated, the raw, reflexive quality of it, not language at all, more like volume. I think mine mostly says stop, he said. Or no. When something is happening that shouldn't be. Fleur looked at him for a long moment with an expression he was learning to read as her thinking hard face, which looked superficially like her dismissive face and could be confused for it by someone not paying attention. Maybe the compulsion charms were pushing in one direction, she said slowly, and your magic was always trying to push back. He hadn't thought of it that way. He sat with it for a moment, turning it over. 38 charms saying be this way and 38 instances of his own magic spending 9 years saying actually, no. Not loud enough to break anything. Just, friction. The persistent low-grade wrongness of borrowed shoes. I'm not frightened of tomorrow, he said. Not to reassure her. Just to say it. I know, Fleur said. You weren't frightened last week either, when Maman told you. I would have been. You're not frightened of things that have already happened, he said. It's already done. Being frightened of it doesn't change it. Fleur was quiet for a moment. Then she said, with the directness she applied to most things, that is either very wise or something the compulsion charms made you think, and I cannot tell which. He blinked. Then he laughed, a real one, sharp and sudden, the kind that surprised him, and Fleur looked startled for a moment before something that was definitely a smile crossed her face, there and gone, like that was a response she hadn't been planning on. Maybe both, he said. Henri came back with hot chocolate, and Harry sat with the Alps on the horizon and the lake at his feet and the strange, slightly terrifying feeling of being somewhere that felt nothing like where he usually was, and he thought, tomorrow people are going to talk about me in a room, and I'm going to sit there and let them, and then something is going to change. He thought, good. The examination had happened the day before they'd left for Geneva. It was the part Harry had been least certain about, less the tribunal, which was an abstract future thing, and more the 3 hours in the hotel sitting room with 2 curse-breakers who had come prepared with equipment he mostly didn't recognize and the careful, professional manner of people who were good at their jobs and knew it without making a production of it. Their names were Eric Solberg and Miriam Okafor. Eric was Norwegian, broad-shouldered, with the kind of patient quiet Harry associated with people who spent a lot of time doing careful work in confined spaces, and Miriam was Nigerian-British, fast-talking and precise, with a habit of humming quietly under her breath when she was analyzing something complex, which Harry found inexplicably reassuring. Have you ever had a magical examination before? Miriam asked, setting up what looked like a miniature astrolabe made of copper wire and what might have been actual starlight. No, Harry said. It's not uncomfortable. You'll feel a sensation like pressure, sometimes, or warmth. Some people describe it as feeling slightly watched, which is technically accurate. If anything hurts, tell me immediately. She looked at him directly. Anything at all. Don't assume it's normal and push through it. Okay, he said. Do you have questions before we start? He had about 40 questions, but he narrowed it down. Can you tell who put them there? Miriam exchanged a brief look with Eric. Potentially, she said. Curse-breaking methodology can identify what we call magical signature, a kind of individual fingerprint that skilled practitioners leave in their work. Whether we can identify a specific person from the signature depends on whether we have a reference for comparison. A pause. In some cases, a signature can be identified without direct comparison if it's well documented enough in existing literature. He noted the slight care in that answer. He noted the brief look. He filed them both. All right, he said. Go ahead. The examination was, as advertised, not painful. It was strange, the feeling of something moving over and through him that was not physical, not quite mental, more like the awareness of depth in a thing you'd previously experienced only as surface. He sat in the hotel chair and watched Miriam and Eric's instruments and their faces and learned something from both. The instruments responded to some of the charms with ordinary, measured movements, professional confirmation of something already identified, the kind of response that said yes, there, as expected. But a few of them, the oldest ones, he thought, from the way Eric would slow down and spend more time with certain areas, produced instrument responses that were slightly different in character, more complex, more layered, and produced in both examiners expressions of tight, controlled professionalism that were doing the same job Apolline's levelness had done at the ministry function, containing something that would be unproductive to express in the moment. When they finished, Miriam sat back and looked at her notes for a moment before she looked at him. "I want to show you something," she said. "You don't have to look at it if you'd prefer not to." "Show me," he said. She turned the copper wire astrolabe toward him. It was projecting something, a three-dimensional structure, roughly spherical, made of what looked like light in several colors, with different intensities and different textures. It was, he realized, looking at him. Or rather, it was looking at what was on him. "The blue filaments are the most recent workings," Miriam said. "They're also the most straightforward in intent, compliance reinforcement, primarily. The yellow ones are mid-range, probably placed between the ages of 3 and 6. She paused. "The red ones are the oldest. They're also the most architecturally complex. Some of them have," another pause, and she was choosing words carefully, he could see that. "They've integrated with your natural magical development. Your magic has grown around them the way a tree grows around a fence. The fence was always there, so the tree incorporated it." He looked at the red filaments. There were 7 of them, and they were interwoven with something that was presumably his own magical structure in a way that was almost elegant, if you were the kind of person who could look at a thing that shouldn't exist and notice its craftsmanship. "Will they come off?" he asked. He'd asked Apolline the same thing, and he was asking again because he needed more than one person to confirm it. "Yes," Miriam said, and she said it without the slight hesitation Apolline had used, which meant either she was more confident or less careful, and he thought probably more confident. "The integrated ones will take longer and require a specialist. We'll need a controlled removal process. You can't take all of these off at once. The interaction between the enchantments means removing them too quickly could cause," she stopped. "Could cause what?" "Instability," Eric said, speaking for the first time in about 40 minutes. His voice was measured. "Your magical system has been operating with these as part of its structure for your entire life. Removing them all at once would be like removing the foundation of a building while people are still inside. We take them off in sequence, carefully, and monitor how your magic responds between removals." Harry looked at the model of himself in the astrolabe. 38 colored filaments tangled through something that was presumably him. He thought, "I have been walking around with this in me my entire life, every day, every hour, and I had no idea." He thought, "Someone built this, deliberately, carefully." He thought, "Someone chose to do this to a child." He didn't feel rage, exactly. He felt something colder and more precise, which was that he wanted to know exactly who, and why, and he wanted to hear them explain it to a room full of people whose job was to decide whether the explanation was good enough. "When can we start removing them?" he asked. Miriam looked at Eric, then at Harry. "After the preliminary hearing," she said. "We want the full legal record established before we begin the removal process. If we remove evidence before it's officially documented, it becomes easier to dispute," he said. "Exactly. All right," he said. "Then we do the hearing first." He had thought, leaving the examination room, that the thing he was mostly feeling was impatience. The specific impatience of someone who had been told a thing was fixable and was now being required to wait for the fix. He'd sat outside with Fleur, who had looked at his face and not said anything for a full minute before asking if he wanted to go for a walk, which turned out to be the right instinct entirely. He thought about those red filaments for a long time. The preliminary hearing convened at 10 in the morning. Harry sat in the observer's gallery with Henri, who had explained the structure of the proceedings with the patience of a man who had spent years translating complicated institutional things into comprehensible ones for his extraordinary wife and daughter. The gallery was separated from the chamber floor by a low carved rail and 3 rows of seating. Below them, 5 panel members sat in a curved arrangement at the elevated adjudicator's bench, 4 women and 1 man, none of whom Harry recognized, all of whom had the focused stillness of people who were here to listen and then decide, which was a quality he already found reassuring. At the petitioner's table sat Apolline and Hestia Papadopoulos, with 2 junior colleagues and a stack of documents that seemed to grow every time Harry looked at it. Apolline was in deep blue today, and she sat with the easy, grounded quality of someone who was in the right place and knew it. At the respondents' table, on the opposite side of the chamber, sat a British ministry delegation of 4. Harry had been told that Dumbledore himself would not be present at the preliminary hearing. It was for establishing the parameters and jurisdiction of the tribunal, not for examination of individuals. The senior British representative was a man named Thaddeus Nimue, who had the look of someone doing a job he found distasteful but had been directed to do, and beside him was a woman Harry had not seen before and Henri had identified, quietly, as Dumbledore's private legal counsel, a witch named Celeste Ward who had 30 years of ICW procedural experience and moved through the room like she owned it. "She will argue jurisdictional challenge first," Henri murmured to Harry. "She will challenge whether the Article 7 provision properly applies. Then she will argue scope limitation." "What does scope limitation mean?" "It means she will try to narrow what the tribunal is permitted to examine. If she can restrict it to the specific enchantments as identified, and prevent the panel from examining the broader context, why the enchantments were placed, by whom, under what authorization, it becomes harder to reach the people at the center of it." Harry watched Celeste Ward arrange her documents with the efficiency of someone who had done this so many times the actions were automatic. "She doesn't look worried," he said. "She's very good," Henri agreed. "Apolline is better." Below them, the panel's senior adjudicator, a severe-looking Japanese woman named Adjudicator Tanaka, whose directness Apolline had mentioned with something that sounded like professional admiration, called the session to order, and the preliminary hearing of the matter of International Confederation of Wizards versus Persons Unknown, Harry James Potter began. Celeste Ward was on her feet within 4 minutes of opening statements, exactly as Henri had predicted, with the jurisdictional challenge delivered in flawless ICW procedural language that managed to be both respectful and entirely without concession. The argument was tight. Article 7 required demonstrable evidence of ongoing international dimension to the harm, and the enchantments as identified were domestic in placement and effect, therefore the proper venue was the British Wisingamat, therefore this tribunal lacked standing. Apolline waited until Ward had finished. Then she stood, and she said, with the conversational authority of someone who had been ready for this since Tuesday, Article 7, subsection 3, extends jurisdiction to the ICW when the subject of magical harm holds a designation of international magical significance. I direct the panel to Exhibit 3 in the filing package, which documents Mr. Potter's status under the International Registry of Magically Significant Persons, which designation was applied in 1981 by the ICW itself. A pause. Additionally, the primary individual whose magical signature appears in the enchantment lattice holds active status as a sitting member of this institution, which creates a direct international dimension that domestic proceedings cannot adequately address without conflict of interest. She didn't say Dumbledore's name. She didn't need to. She said this institution in a tone that placed it in the room like a piece of evidence on a table, and watched the panel members receive it. Adjudicator Tanaka looked at Ward. The Article 7 subsection 3 argument appears sound to this bench. I'll hear a response on the merits. Ward responded. Apolline countered. They went back and forth for 40 minutes with the disciplined, refereed quality of a fencing match between two people who were both very good, neither losing ground dramatically, both probing for the point where the other was slightly weaker. Harry watched it with full attention, which Fleur would have recognized as his real attention rather than his polite attention, and he thought, this is how you fight when you're fighting smart. Not louder. More precisely. The jurisdictional challenge was denied. Ward absorbed the ruling with professional grace and immediately moved to scope limitation. This argument took longer and was more interesting. Ward's position was that the tribunal's examination should be restricted to the identification and authorized removal of the enchantments, full stop, no inquiry into origin, intent, or the individuals responsible for placement, on the grounds that such inquiry exceeded the remedial purpose of Article 7 proceedings. Hestia Papadopoulos stood for this one, and she delivered the counter-argument with the slightly rougher, more human energy of someone who had been doing child protection work for 20 years and had strong feelings she was keeping in check through a combination of professionalism and iron will. Remediation without accountability, she said, is not remediation. It is a prescription for recurrence. Article 7's mandate explicitly includes protective orders, and a protective order that does not address the source of harm is meaningless. The panel cannot authorize removal of the enchantments and simultaneously prohibit inquiry into why 38 compulsion charms were placed on a 9-year-old by a person as yet unnamed in these proceedings. She paused, just briefly, and then said, with precision, if the respondent objects to inquiry into origin and intent, this bench might reasonably ask why. In the observer's gallery, Henri quietly exhaled. Harry glanced at him. That was good, Henri said softly. Yes, Harry agreed. The scope limitation challenge was denied with the caveat that inquiry into origin and intent would be subject to evidence standard, which was a concession Apolline had already told him they expected and could live with. Ward sat down. The British delegation conferred in low voices. Adjudicator Tanaka set the schedule. Formal examination sessions would commence in 3 weeks, allowing time for the complete documentation of all 38 enchantments by the examining cursebreakers. Parties were required to submit witness lists within 10 days. All evidence was to be presented in written form at least 5 days before it would be raised in session. Then Tanaka looked up from her schedule notes and said, "Is the subject present?" A small silence. Then Apolline said, "He is in the observer's gallery." Tanaka looked up at the gallery. She looked at Harry directly, across the chamber, with the level regard of someone who was making an assessment rather than a performance. "Mr. Potter," she said. "This proceeding is being conducted in your interest and with your consent, which has been provided through your designated advocate, Madame Delacour. At any point during these proceedings, you may request to address the panel directly. Do you understand that?" Harry stood up. He wasn't sure why, it just seemed right, when being spoken to formally, to stand. Henri glanced at him and didn't say anything. "Yes," Harry said. "I understand. Do you have any questions or concerns to raise at this stage?" He thought about it for a moment. Below him, the chamber was quiet in the focused way of 30 professionals waiting. "I want to be involved," he said. "I don't just want to be the subject of it. I want to know what's happening, and what the evidence shows, and what the options are." He paused. "I know I'm 9. One of the panel members, a tall woman with braided gray hair who Harry would later learn was Adjudicator Osei from Ghana, almost smiled. Tanaka said, "Noted, Mr. Potter. Madame Delacour, please ensure Mr. Potter is kept fully informed of all developments." "Of course," Apolline said. "Is there anything further at this stage?" Celeste Ward stood again. "The British Ministry wishes it noted for the record that the individual whose signature appears in the complainant's identification has not been formally named in these proceedings, and that premature identification in public forum could constitute prejudicial." "Noted," Tanaka said, without particular inflection. "And this bench also notes that the magical signature evidence will be examined as a matter of established procedure. The individual in question will be formally notified of their status as person of interest concurrent with today's proceeding, if they have not already been." A pause. "The session is adjourned." The chamber came back to its own noise. Harry sat down. He watched Apolline cross the chamber floor to speak with Hestia, and he watched Celeste Ward speak quietly with the British delegation, and he watched Adjudicator Tanaka make notes in a precise, unhurried hand. "How do you feel?" Henri asked. Harry thought about it. "Like something started," he said. "Not finished." "Started." "Yes," Henri said. "That's right. This was the beginning. How long will it take?" "Months," Henri said honestly. "This is the kind of thing that takes months. The law moves the way it moves, and faster is not always better when the stakes are this high." He looked at Harry with the direct, thoughtful regard of a man who didn't talk down to people regardless of their age. "Can you be patient?" Harry thought about the red filaments in the astrolabe. 14 months old. 9 years of growing around them. I've been patient for 9 years without knowing it, he said. I think I can manage a few more months. The letter from Geneva reached Dumbledore at dinner. He read it at the table, which he never did. Correspondence at meals was a personal rule he'd held to for 60 years, on the grounds that it was rude to the other people present. He read it anyway, and McGonagall, sitting 3 seats down, watched him do it with the attention she gave to things she was worried about and didn't yet understand. He folded the letter when he finished and set it beside his plate with the care of someone placing something fragile. Everything all right, Albus? Phileas Flitwick asked, from across the table. Quite fine, Dumbledore said, and returned to his dinner with the serene manner that had, over the course of 60 years, made most people assume that whatever was happening was therefore manageable. It was one of his most useful qualities and one of his most dangerous ones, and he was aware of both. After dinner, he went to his office and sat down and looked at his hands for a while. They were an old man's hands now, mapped with veins, spotted with age, and they had done a great many things over the course of the years that were mapped into them, some of which he was proud of, some of which he was ambivalent about, and some of which he had told himself were necessary in the way you told yourself necessary things when you were the person who had decided they were necessary. He thought about Harry Potter at 9 years old, and he thought about Harry Potter at 1 year old, and he thought about the choice he'd made in the ruins of a house in Godric's Hollow on the 1st of November 1981, and the long chain of choices that had followed it. He had made each choice with the same clear-eyed certainty, that the boy had a destiny, and that destiny required preparation, and that preparation sometimes required sacrifices that the person being prepared could not consent to because they were too young to understand the stakes. He had told himself this was love of a particular kind, the hardest kind, the kind that looked like something else from close up. He thought about the letter in his desk drawer. 38 compulsion charms. 14 months of age at oldest placement. He thought about Apolline Delacour, whom he knew by reputation and had met twice, who had walked into a ministry function and looked at his work on a child and written a complaint that evening. There was, he acknowledged to himself in the quiet of his office, a difference between what he had intended and what he had built. He had intended architecture. He had, apparently, built a cage. The question was whether that distinction would survive a tribunal. He already suspected it wouldn't. He picked up his quill and began writing to Celeste Ward, not defensively, not apologetically, but strategically, because strategy was the language he'd spoken for 60 years and he spoke it better than any other. He wrote, "The panel will press for the intent behind the original placement. This is where we must be most precise. The intent was protection, always protection. This must be established as the governing frame before any other characterization is allowed to take hold. If we establish intent first, the question becomes not, was this harmful, but was this the right method for a legitimate goal? The first question allows for only one answer. The second allows for a conversation." He paused. He thought, is that true, Albus? Is that actually true? He thought about the red filaments. The ones laid at 14 months. The ones that had grown into the boy's magic like a fence in a tree. He thought, I don't know. He had not thought that before. Not about this. The uncertainty arrived in his chest with the specific weight of something that had been there for a while and had finally become too heavy to pretend otherwise. He finished the letter to Ward and sent it off and sat in his office alone for a long time, with the portraits of previous headmasters silent on the walls around him, and thought about the difference between a plan and a cage, and about whether a man who had spent 70 years being certain was capable of surviving the discovery that he was wrong. He thought he probably was. He thought that surviving it and deserving to survive it might be different things. He went to bed. He did not sleep for a long time. 3 weeks later, the formal examinations began. Eric and Miriam presented their complete documentation of all 38 enchantments to the tribunal panel on a Tuesday morning in Geneva, and the room listened to an hour of precise, technical testimony with the focused quiet of people who were building a picture and already didn't like what they were seeing. The final count was 38. The complete breakdown was read into the record: 22 behavioral modification charms of varying intensity, 9 trust direction enchantments of a sophistication rarely seen outside of experimental magical theory, for what Eric called capability suppression workings, charms specifically designed to prevent the subject from accessing or displaying levels of magical ability that would draw attention, and 3 that defied clean categorization and that Eric described, with the careful language of a professional who'd chosen his words twice before speaking, as identity-anchoring enchantments, designed to establish and maintain a specific self-conception in the subject consistent with a predetermined role. The panel was very still. Identity-anchoring, repeated adjudicator Osei, her voice even. Can you describe the intended effect of such a working? The subject, Eric said, would experience a persistent internal sense of a specific identity. Not a false memory, not an experience of events that didn't occur. More a gravitational pull toward a particular self-understanding. The subject would feel, and believe, that they were a certain kind of person. The enchantment would reinforce that sense and make deviation from it feel internally wrong, even threatening. And in this case, adjudicator Osei said, what identity was being anchored? A pause. Eric looked at his notes, though Harry suspected he didn't need to. Someone unimportant, he said. Someone who did not seek attention or advancement. Someone who could be relied upon to follow trusted authority figures rather than act independently. A pause. Someone expendable. The word sat in the chamber. In the observer's gallery, Harry was very still. He thought, unimportant. He thought, someone who could be relied upon. He thought, expendable. He looked at his hands in his lap and he thought about the whole 9 years of his life, the Dursleys' house, the cupboard under the stairs, the way he'd always felt slightly wrong and slightly borrowed, like wearing someone else's shoes, and he thought, this is why. He thought, someone decided, before I could speak, what I was going to be. He thought, not anymore. He looked up from his hands and found Apolline looking at him from across the chamber, not checking on him, not worried about him, just looking at him with the level, steady regard of someone who wanted him to know they saw him. He met her eyes and he did not look away and he did not look sad and he did not look frightened. He looked like someone who had just been given a very clear picture of a problem and had already started working out how to solve it. In the chamber below, adjudicator Tanaka said, and the magical signature of the primary practitioner responsible for the majority of these workings, have you made an identification? Eric said, yes. We have. He gave the name. He gave it in the clean, precise language of a professional reading from a certified report, and the name filled the chamber with the weight of everything it carried, the history, the reputation, the extraordinary career, and also with the weight of what it now meant in this specific context, in this specific room, said in this specific way. The panel absorbed it. Ward, at the respondents' table, wrote something on her parchment and underlined it. Hestia Papadopoulos, without moving her face, exhaled slowly through her nose. Apolline, looking at Harry, allowed herself one small, precise nod. The tribunal was no longer a preliminary matter. It had a name in it now, the right name, on the record, in a certified report, in an ICW proceeding that was going to be conducted whether or not anyone in Britain was comfortable with that. The architecture of control that had been built around Harry Potter's life was going to be examined, piece by piece, in a room that had absorbed 200 years of people being told they were wrong, and it was going to be examined until every filament was named, and every choice was accounted for, and every person who had made those choices was required to stand in the light and explain themselves. Harry sat in the observer's gallery and felt the first charm come off, not physically, not yet, but in the way that knowing a thing changes you, the way that sitting in a room and hearing someone name the exact nature of the cage you've lived in for 9 years changes the air in your lungs, and he felt it go, and the space where it had been wasn't empty. It was his. Chapter 3, The shape of the cage. France in December was cold in a way Harry hadn't expected, not the grey, wet cold of Surrey, but a clean, bright cold that came off the Atlantic and made the world feel sharper at its edges. The Delacour house was outside Orleans, a rambling stone building that had been added to across 4 centuries by a family who had strong opinions about rooms and no consistent opinions about architecture, and it sat at the end of a lane flanked by bare plane trees and looked, in the winter light, like something from a story. Harry stood in the lane with his single bag and looked at it for a moment. "It's bigger than it looks," Fleur said, from beside him. She'd said it with the automatic quality of someone who'd said it before, probably to everyone who stood in this lane for the first time. "It looks quite big," Harry said. "Then it is much bigger than it looks," Fleur said, and walked up the path. The ICW had authorized Harry's relocation from Privet Drive within 72 hours of Eric and Miriam's testimony, on the grounds that returning him to the care of people who had been, at minimum, complicit in the conditions surrounding his situation was counterproductive to the Tribunal's protective mandate. The speed of that ruling had visibly surprised the British delegation and visibly not surprised Apolline, who had drafted the relocation request herself and had anticipated every procedural objection before it was raised. The Dursleys had not contested it. Vernon had gone a particular shade of purple when the ICW welfare officer had appeared at the door with Apolline and 2 colleagues, and then had gone a different shade, closer to the color of old putty, when Apolline had looked at him with a specific quality of attention, and had said nothing at all. Petunia had said, very quietly, "It's better this way," and Harry wasn't sure whether she meant better for him or better for them, and he'd decided it didn't matter. He'd packed everything he owned in 40 minutes. It hadn't taken 40 minutes because he had a lot. Now he was in France, in a house at the end of a lane of bare plane trees, and Fleur had said it's bigger than it looks and walked inside, and Harry followed her, and the house did turn out to be much bigger than it looked. It smelled like wood smoke and something baking and the specific warmth of a building that had been lived in continuously and happily for a very long time. There was an enormous kitchen that seemed to be the center of gravity around which all other rooms orbited, and a sitting room with books stacked in ways that suggested the bookshelves had long since been treated as suggestions rather than mandates, and a dog that turned out to be 3 dogs when Harry bent down to pet what he'd thought was one. "The gray one is Miette," Fleur said, from the kitchen doorway. "The brown one is called After Midnight because Gabriel named him and was going through a phase. The small one doesn't technically have a name because we keep meaning to name her and then don't." "What do you call her?" "Dog." "That's a name," Harry said. Dog was sitting on his foot with the complete authority of an animal who had decided this was now her location and Harry was now her person. She was about the size of a bread loaf and appeared to have no opinion about her own dignity whatsoever. "Don't tell her that or she'll become insufferable," Fleur said. "Come and have dinner. Maman is in Geneva until Thursday and Papa made ratatouille, which he always makes too much of." Harry straightened up, Dog still attached to his foot, and followed Fleur into the kitchen where Henri was at the stove and a younger child Harry hadn't met yet was sitting at the kitchen table drawing something with intense concentration. "This is Gabrielle," Henri said, without turning from the stove. "She is 7 and very serious about her art. Gabby, say hello to Harry." Gabrielle looked up. She had the same silver hair as her mother and sister, and enormous blue eyes, and she looked at Harry with the frank, uncomplicated assessment of a child who hadn't yet learned to make her looking polite. "You're the one Maman went to London for," she said. "Yes," Harry said. "She said you had a lot of bad magic on you." "Gabrielle," Henri said, with the tone of a parent who was not actually going to follow through on the warning. "It's all right," Harry said. "Yes. That's right." Gabrielle looked at him for another moment. Then she returned to her drawing with the same intensity she'd had before, apparently satisfied. "I hope they take it all off," she said, to her paper. "It sounds uncomfortable." "It is a bit," Harry agreed, which was true in a way he hadn't quite articulated to anyone before, but which turned out to be easy to say to a 7-year-old who asked directly. Dinner was ratatouille and bread and a conversation that moved between French and English without apparent effort, Henri asking Harry questions that were interested without being invasive, Fleur contributing opinions on everything with the regularity of someone who viewed silence as a resource to be spent efficiently, and Gabrielle at the end of the table alternating between eating and drawing until Henri moved the paper out of range of the sauce. Harry ate 2 full bowls of ratatouille and 3 pieces of bread and felt something settle in him that he couldn't name, not happiness exactly, or not only happiness, but the specific feeling of a body that has been operating in a state of low-level deprivation for a long time suddenly having enough. Enough food, enough warmth, enough noise of the right kind. Enough people who spoke to him like speaking to him was a thing they were doing rather than a thing they were enduring. He helped Henri with the washing up and went to the room they'd shown him, a small room at the end of the upper corridor with slanted ceilings and a window that looked out onto the bare plane trees, and he sat on the bed for a while with Dog on his lap and thought about nothing in particular, which turned out to be a new experience and was excellent. The first charm came off on a Thursday morning in the second week of December. They'd been doing the removals in Geneva, in a secure examination room with Eric and Miriam and a specialist named Dr. Cressida Albrecht, who worked specifically in enchantment removal and who had, upon meeting Harry, looked at the astrolabe model for 4 minutes in complete silence before saying, with the calm of someone delivering a weather report, "This is the most sophisticated piece of behavioral modification work I have ever encountered in 30 years of practice. I want to be clear that I mean that as an observation, not a compliment." "Understood," Harry had said. "The first one we remove will be the most recent placement. 6 months old, low integration, compliance reinforcement." She looked at him over her glasses. "You may feel nothing. You may feel a significant amount. It depends on the individual and on the specific working. Do you have questions? Will I behave differently afterward?" She considered this. Possibly. The charm was reinforcing existing compliance responses. Removing it won't necessarily change your behavior, but it may change your experience of your own behavior. You may notice a sense of reduction in the pull towards certain responses. Like realizing you've been holding a weight you weren't aware of. "All right," Harry said. "Go ahead." The removal itself took about 12 minutes and felt, as she described, like something he couldn't quite characterize, not painful, not exactly, but with a quality of resistance, like something that had been fixed in place for months objecting briefly to being moved. There was a single sharp moment, 3 seconds, maybe 4, of something that he'd describe afterward, to Fleur, as loud, and then it was gone. He sat in the chair afterward and breathed, and Dr. Albrecht made notes and checked her instruments, and Eric asked him what he was experiencing. He thought about it carefully. He wanted to give an accurate answer, not a reassuring one. "I keep noticing things I want to say that I'd normally let pass," he said finally. "Such as? The ward on this room has a gap in the southeast corner. I've noticed it every session and not mentioned it." He paused. "I was going to mention it today and then didn't. And then noticed I didn't. And then noticed that I'd noticed I didn't." Eric made a note. The charm was suppressing unprompted observations that might be perceived as presumptuous or attention-seeking, he said. Noticing security vulnerabilities in a room full of professional cursebreakers would fall under that category. Harry thought about 9 years of noticing things and letting them pass because noticing things aloud led to attention and attention led to questions and questions led, historically, to unpleasant outcomes. He thought about how thoroughly that could become automatic. How you could stop knowing you were doing it. "There's also a gap in the northeast corner," he said. "It's smaller." Miriam, without looking up from her own notes, said, "I know. Thank you." She said it in the tone of someone who was pleased, and that was also new. The specific experience of a competent adult being pleased at something you'd contributed rather than being pleased at you for not causing problems. He sat with that for a moment. Then he said, "When's the next one?" They came off one at a time, spread across weeks, and the effect was cumulative in ways that were not dramatic and were not small. It was not the thunderclap transformation of a story, it was more the way the world looked different after your eyes adjusted to a new light, a gradual sharpening of resolution that was only apparent when you looked back at what you'd been seeing before. The capability suppression workings came off in January. Those were the interesting ones. Harry had always known, in the practical way of someone who had evidence, that his magic was unusual. The things that happened, the school roof, the lock, the burned patches, had suggested a level of raw magical output that was, even without formal training, more than ordinary. But there's a difference between knowing something as an abstraction and experiencing what it's been held back from for 9 years. The first capability suppression removal happened on a Wednesday morning, and Harry spent Wednesday afternoon in the examination room demonstrating, at Dr. Albrecht's professionally calm request, a series of simple wandless exercises from a primer sheet placed on the table. He moved through the first 6 in approximately 12 minutes, which was more than twice the expected rate for someone his age, which was itself already ahead of curve. When he reached the 7th, which was rated as advanced intermediate for an adult practitioner, he paused. He'd felt something shift in the week since the removal. The low-grade friction he'd noticed his whole life, the borrowed shoes quality, was different in this area. Not gone entirely, there were still 3 more capability charms to remove, but different in character, like a door that had been locked had been moved to merely latched. He did the 7th exercise. Dr. Albrecht's instrument, which had been making steady measured sounds, produced a different sound. Not louder. More complex. Eric said, "Interesting." "What?" Harry said. "The working wasn't just suppressing output magnitude," Eric said, looking at his instruments with the focused attention of someone recalculating. "It was also suppressing something else. Can you try the 8th exercise?" "That's post-OWL level," Dr. Albrecht said. "Yes," Eric agreed. "Try it anyway." Harry tried the 8th exercise. The instrument sound changed again. Miriam set down her quill and looked at Harry with an expression that was professionally contained in a way that meant it was covering something fairly significant. "Harry," she said, "how does that feel? What you just did?" He thought about it. It felt like speaking at normal volume after a very long time of whispering. Not effortful. Not draining. Just the right amount. "Fine," he said. "Easy, actually." "Yes," Miriam said. "That's what I was concerned about." "Concerned?" "Not about you," she clarified. "About what the charm was doing." She looked at Eric. "We need to document this separately." He was 9 years old and could execute post-OWL level wandless magic with the ease of breathing, and that was, with 3 capability charms still in place, not his actual ceiling. He sat in the chair in the examination room and received this information with the equanimity of someone who'd spent 9 years being told, in 38 different magical languages, to be small, and found that they didn't particularly want to do that anymore. "Good," he said simply. Eric looked up from his documentation. He almost smiled. "Yes," he said. "Good." Sirius Black's file arrived on Apolline's desk on a Wednesday afternoon in late January, placed there by Hestia's assistant with a note attached that said only, "Related thread." Apolline read it over the course of an evening, and then read it again, and then put it face down on her desk and looked at the wall for a while. She brought it to Harry the next morning. He was in the Delacour kitchen. He'd been relocated to the house full-time now, the Geneva sessions happening 3 times a week by Portkey, eating toast and having an argument with Fleur about whether the organizational structure of the French Quidditch League was evidence of systemic mismanagement or just bad luck, which was the kind of argument they had about everything and which had evolved, over 2 months, from Fleur stating positions and Harry listening to them going at it with equal intensity from opposite directions while Henri read his newspaper in peace and occasionally contributed a devastating 1-sentence observation that derailed both of them. She waited for them to reach a natural pause and then said, "Harry, I need to show you something. It's not about the charms." He looked at her immediately. He had a particular quality of attention when she shifted tone. There was a version of his listening that was polite and social and easy, and then there was the other kind, the full kind, the kind that was like turning a lens into focus. He switched to the full kind now and said, "All right." Fleur, recognizing the register, stopped arguing and became very interested in her tea in the way of someone who intended to hear everything. Apolline sat down and put the file on the table. "In the course of the Tribunal's examination of actions connected to your situation, the panel's investigative team has been pulling related matters. things that happened in the same period or by the same hands. Tribunal procedure. You check whether the thing you're examining is isolated or part of a pattern. Okay, Harry said. They found something. She looked at him. Have you ever heard the name Sirius Black? A pause. Something moved in his face, not recognition exactly, but the sense of a word that existed at the edge of something, not quite reachable. It sounds, he stopped. I've heard it. I don't know where. He was your father's best friend, Apolline said. Your godfather. Under your parents' will, he was named as your guardian in the event of their deaths. Harry was very still. He's been in Azkaban prison for 8 years, Apolline said. He was accused of betraying your parents to Voldemort and of killing a wizard named Peter Pettigrew. Was he? She looked at him. No. The stillness in Harry lasted for a moment, and then something happened in his face, not the quick controlled reactions she'd been watching for 2 months, but something else, something that came from further in, a flash of something raw that was there and then gone because he pulled it back with the habit of years. She thought, those identity-anchoring charms are still in place. Even now, even foregone, his first response to something this significant is to pull it back. No, she said again, gently. He didn't do it. Pettigrew was an animagus, he could transform into a rat, and he faked his own death. He was the traitor, not Sirius. There is evidence of this that has been in existence for 8 years and has never been brought before a court because Sirius was never given a trial. Harry said, very quietly, he was never given a trial. Correct. He's been in Azkaban for 8 years without a trial. Yes. The kitchen was quiet. Gabrielle had apparently decided to be elsewhere, with the instinct of a 7-year-old who understood when a room needed fewer people. Dog was under the table. The winter light came through the window and lay flat and even across the table. Dumbledore knew, Harry said. Not a question. We believe so. He knew and didn't tell anyone. His voice was flat, not dead but compressed, like he was keeping something from taking up too much room. He knew who my godfather was. He knew there was someone who was supposed to take care of me. And he stopped. He placed you with your aunt and uncle instead, Apolline said. And placed enchantments on you that included trust direction workings that would have made it very difficult for you to seek out or trust people connected to your parents' world. The silence this time had a different quality. Fleur, who had been very still across the table, said, he closed the door. He closed every door and then put locks on your hands so you wouldn't reach for them. Harry looked at her. She was watching him with the directness she always had, no softening, but her eyes were doing something they rarely did, which was being openly, completely angry on someone else's behalf. Yes, Harry said slowly. That's what he did. He picked up his toast and took a bite of it, and Apolline thought, there it is. Not the pullback, not the suppression, but something else, the deliberate choice of someone deciding not to perform their grief for an audience, putting it somewhere internal where it could be processed properly, choosing action over reaction. Not because he'd been taught to be small. Because he'd decided to be efficient. What's happening for Sirius, he said. The Tribunal's investigative team is preparing a referral to the ICW's Wrongful Imprisonment Division, Apolline said. Given the evidence, and given that Sirius's imprisonment is connected to the same pattern of, she chose the word carefully, management of your situation, the panel has strong grounds for a parallel proceeding. How long? If the evidence holds, weeks. Not months. Harry nodded. He finished his toast. Can I see the file? I was going to ask if you wanted to. Yes. He pulled it toward him and opened it, and read it with the full attention quality she'd come to rely on, his eyes moving steadily down each page, and she watched him read the evidence of 8 years of wrongful imprisonment and put it together with the evidence of 9 years of deliberate shaping, and she watched him not crumble under the weight of it but organize it, the way you organize the components of a problem you intended to solve. When he finished, he closed the file and looked at her. I want to go to the tribunal session when Sirius comes up, he said. I expected that. Can I speak? Not just as a subject. As someone with something to say about it. She held his gaze. I will make it happen, she said. He pushed the file back to her. He stood up, and Dog immediately emerged from under the table to sit on his foot with the consistency of something magnetic, and he looked down at her with an expression that was almost fond and deeply distracted, and then he looked at Fleur. Come on, he said. I need to practice. The 10th exercise. Fleur had been watching him with the careful attention she gave him when something significant had happened. Now she stood up with the decision of someone who'd made an assessment and landed on the right response, which was, forward, together. The 10th is very difficult, she said. I know, Harry said, heading for the back garden where they'd been doing practice sessions for the past 3 weeks, Dog attached to his foot and requiring a modified gait. I could probably do it, Fleur said, following. You probably couldn't yet, Harry said, but I'll teach you how I do it. You've done it once. Twice. I was practicing last night. Fleur, behind him, made an expression that was half exasperated and half something she wouldn't have named if asked. Apolline, from the kitchen window, watched them cross the frost-white garden, Harry already conjuring the small light form that was the basis of the exercise, and Dog trying to catch it, and she allowed herself something she rarely allowed at work, which was simple satisfaction. Not because the fight was won. It was nowhere near won. But because the boy who had stood in a phone box lift 2 months ago with the careful, flinching quality of someone who'd learned to inhabit his own life as minimally as possible was standing in her back garden practicing magic that should have been beyond him and teaching her daughter simultaneously and looking, for the first time, like someone who was actually here. She went back to the file. There was work to do. The first snow came the same week Dumbledore's formal legal response arrived in Geneva. Harry read it. Apolline had kept her word about keeping him informed of everything, sitting at the kitchen table on a Sunday morning while Fleur was at her weekly lesson in Orleans and Gabrielle was drawing dogs, possibly dogs specifically, in the sitting room. It was 46 pages long. He read all 46 pages with the attention it required and the patience it deserved. Because the document was not stupid, Ward had constructed it carefully and Dumbledore had clearly contributed to the substance of the arguments, and you could not effectively respond to something you hadn't actually read. The central argument was this: the enchantments had been placed in the context of an extraordinary and unprecedented threat. Voldemort's first defeat had not guaranteed his non-return. The likelihood of his return, which Dumbledore argued was near certain, created a situation in which Harry Potter, the individual whose survival had brought about the defeat, needed to be protected, guided, and prepared, in ways that a child could not consent to and an ordinary guardian could not ensure. The enchantments were not, the document argued, compulsion in the malicious sense, but prophylactic preparation, a gardener's careful shaping of a tree that would one day need to bear significant weight. A gardener's careful shaping, Harry said aloud, to no one in particular. Gabrielle, from the other room, called, "What?" "Nothing," he said. He turned the page. The document went on to address the specific enchantments in careful sequence, arguing for each one that the intent was protective rather than harmful, that the effect was within the range of what parents routinely did for children without legal sanction, and that the combination of them, while unusual in its scope, was proportionate to an unusual threat environment. The Sirius Black section was brief. It argued that the circumstances of Black's imprisonment were a separate matter, outside the tribunal's scope, and that Dumbledore's decisions regarding Harry's guardianship had been made in the context of the available information at the time. Harry read that paragraph 3 times. He set the document down and looked at the frost outside the kitchen window for a while. Then he picked up a piece of parchment and a quill. He'd been writing things down since December, observations and questions and things he wanted to say, and he wrote, "The argument is that the threat was extraordinary, therefore the methods were justified. But the methods were applied to the threat, not to me. I was not the threat. I was the one the threat was aimed at. You don't protect a person by reshaping them into the right shape for the danger you've imagined. You protect a person by, actually protecting them. By being present. By being honest. By giving them what they need to face what's coming rather than making them into what you need them to be when it arrives. A tree that's been shaped around a fence doesn't grow stronger. It just grows differently. And when the fence is removed, he stopped. Looked at what he'd written. Thought about the red filaments and the tree grown around them. It has to figure out its actual shape for the first time. He read that back. He thought, that's what I'm doing right now. In this kitchen. In France. Practicing magic I should have always had access to, with a family I should have always known about, without the 34 charms still in place doing their quiet work. That's it exactly. He added, I would like to use this in the tribunal. Not as prepared testimony. As a thing I say, in my own words, when I'm asked. He folded the note and added it to the stack in his room. February arrived with a cold that drove everyone inside and a letter from Hestia Papadopoulos that arrived with Apolline's morning correspondence and that she read standing at the kitchen counter before anyone else was awake. She read it twice, then poured herself a coffee, and went and knocked on Harry's door. He opened it more quickly than someone fully asleep would have. She suspected he'd been awake. Sirius Black has filed for extraordinary review through the ICW wrongful imprisonment panel, she said. They've accepted it on expedited grounds. His hearing is in 3 weeks. Harry looked at her. He was in his pajamas, hair attempting the vertical in 3 directions, glasses already on, which confirmed he'd been awake. Dog had somehow got into his room and was on the bed looking entirely comfortable. 3 weeks, he said. Yes. Will he know I'm there? I'll send word through his advocate. She looked at him steadily. He may not be what you're expecting. 8 years in Azkaban changes people. I know. Harry. I mean it. He will not be, he may be, she paused, choosing. Be ready for it not to be simple. Nothing is simple, Harry said, without bitterness. That's fine. She looked at him in the early grey morning light of the corridor, this boy who had arrived at her hotel in London in November with a bruise on his wrist and 38 chains on his soul and who stood now in a doorway with the same green eyes and the same steadiness but so much more space in him, like removing the charms was not just removing the locks but opening the room they'd been bolted to. Get dressed, she said. We'll go over the session structure over breakfast. The wrongful imprisonment hearing was held in a different chamber from the main tribunal, smaller, more functional, with the particular atmosphere of a room where very serious things happened with minimal ceremony. Harry sat in the front row of the observer section, between Apolline and Henri, and he did not take his eyes off the door through which Sirius Black was brought in. He'd thought about this moment. He'd prepared for it, in the way you prepared for things when you knew preparing couldn't really account for the actual experience. Nothing had prepared him for what walked through that door. Sirius Black was not quite 40 but looked both older and younger than that, older in his eyes, which had the burnt-out quality of someone who'd spent 8 years with Dementors, and younger in his movements, which had the slightly unpredished quality of a man who'd spent 8 years with Dementors and was now in a room without them for the first time. He was thin in a way that suggested the absence of something rather than a natural shape. His hair was long and tangled and his robes were clean, someone had seen to that, at least, and he moved with the deliberate quality of someone being very careful about each choice. He sat down at the table assigned to him and his advocate. He looked at the panel. Then, and only then, he looked at the observer gallery. He found Harry immediately. Harry didn't know if that was because Harry was the only child in the room or because something else directed his eyes, but there was no search in it, his gaze came directly to Harry's face and stopped. Harry looked back. Sirius Black looked at him for 4 seconds, 5, and his face did the most complicated thing Harry had ever watched a human face do, cycling through things too fast and too many to name, and then he stopped the cycling by some effort of will and he looked at Harry with what was left after all the cycling was done, which was something stripped and direct and aching and entirely without pretense. Harry didn't look away. He raised a hand, not a wave, just a single, deliberate lift of his palm. I see you. I'm here. Something broke and then held in Sirius Black's face. He gave a single nod, barely perceptible, and then faced forward again with the focused quality of someone borrowing stability from a source they'd just identified. Apolline, beside Harry, was very still. Henri quietly put a hand briefly on Harry's shoulder and then removed it. The hearing began. The evidence for the wrongful imprisonment case was shorter and more brutal than the main tribunal testimony had been, brutal in the sense of brevity, of how little time it took to establish that a man had spent 8 years in prison without standing in a courtroom to hear the evidence against him. The documents were straightforward. The animagus evidence, recovered from the investigative team's work, was incontrovertible. The advocate presented it cleanly and the panel asked their questions and Ward, attending in her British ministry capacity, made her challenge and Apolline demolished it in about 8 minutes. Sirius Black did not testify in this hearing. He sat at his table with his hands folded in front of him on the surface and he listened to the evidence of his own wrongful imprisonment presented in legal language, and he was very still throughout with the quality of someone who had been in a very small space for a long time and was learning, inch by inch, that the space might actually be larger than he'd believed. The panel retired to consider for 20 minutes. In the corridor outside the chamber, Harry stood by the window overlooking the Geneva Street and Sirius Black stood 3 feet from him and they looked at each other in person without a gallery between them. "You have James's hair," Sirius said. His voice was rough, underused. "People keep saying that," Harry said. "And your mother's eyes, apparently, so," he stopped. "Sorry. Lily's eyes." "My mother." "No," Sirius said. "It's right. Lily's." "Yes." A pause. "Apolline Delacour sent me word that you'd be here." "I didn't know," he stopped. "Tried again." "I didn't know if you'd want to be." "Why wouldn't I?" Sirius's expression moved through something complicated. "Because I wasn't there." "For 8 years, I wasn't, you were in Azkaban," Harry said. "Without a trial." "That's not the same as not wanting to be there." A silence. "No," Sirius said, quietly. "It's not, is it?" "I read the file," Harry said. "All of it. You thought I was dead at first. Then you found out I wasn't and you tried to get to me and you were stopped." He paused. "I know what happened. I'm not angry at you." Sirius Black looked at him with the expression of a man receiving something he hadn't believed was still available. "I am," Harry continued, "fairly angry at some other things and people. But not at you." "Fairly angry," Sirius repeated, with the careful tone of someone testing the exact weight of a phrase. "Very angry," Harry corrected. "But controlled. There's a difference." Something happened in Sirius's face that Harry would later identify as the moment the man stopped being cautious and started being present. It was like watching a fire catch, small, then not. "You sound like your father," Sirius said, "but with better impulse control." "I've been told I have more impulse control than him," yes, Harry said. "James had essentially none. So I've gathered." Sirius almost laughed. It was more of an exhale that had laugh in it, rusty with disuse. "God," he said, soft. "You're all right, aren't you? You're actually all right." "Getting there," Harry said. He looked at Sirius steadily. "Are you?" It was a real question. Sirius received it as such. He looked at the Geneva Street through the window for a moment before he answered. "Ask me again in 6 months," he said. Today I'm going to find out if I'm free. That's about as far as I can manage right now." "That's fair," Harry said. 6 months, then." They stood at the window in the grey February afternoon and waited for the panel to return, side by side, not quite comfortable and not quite strangers, 2 people at the beginning of figuring out what they were to each other. The panel returned in 19 minutes. The ruling took 4. Sirius Black was free. He stood when it was read and he didn't make a sound and his hands were shaking and he put them flat on the table to stop them, and Harry, from the observer's gallery where he'd returned for the reading, watched him and thought, 38 charms on one person, 8 years of prison for another. The same hands. The same choices. The same man who decided, in 1981, what the world was going to be. He thought, not finished yet. But getting there. Outside the chamber window, the Geneva sky had cleared while they were inside, the clouds moving off to reveal a hard, brilliant winter blue. The Alps were white and enormous and perfectly clear in that light, and Harry looked at them through the window and felt, under the 34 charms still in place, doing their quiet work, the shape of himself. He was starting to know the shape of it. He liked what he found. Chapter 4, The Testimony. The formal testimony sessions began on the first Monday of March, and Geneva was doing something between winter and spring that couldn't decide which it was, the mornings still hard with cold, the afternoons occasionally bright enough to make you believe in something, the light-shifting quality of a world in the middle of becoming. Harry arrived with Apolline and Henri 20 minutes before the session opened, which was how they always arrived, and he spent those 20 minutes in the delegation room going over the witness list for the day with the focused attention that had become his standard operating mode. He could hear, through the walls, the sound of the chamber filling on the other side, the specific acoustic of a large formal space receiving a lot of people at once, the layered murmur of 20 languages, the particular energy of a proceeding that had, over the past weeks, become something the international magical community was paying close attention to. The press had found the story in February. Not the British press, the British papers had been conspicuously quiet, which Apolline had told him was itself a kind of information, but the French magical journals had run it first, and then the German ones, and then the international wire services that served magical communities across 12 countries, and now the proceedings had a quality to them that they hadn't had in the preliminary stages, a weight of scrutiny that changed the atmosphere in the building. Harry had read some of the coverage. The French pieces were measured and legal in their framing. A German weekly had run something longer and more analytical. The British silence was, as Apolline said, information. How many witnesses today? He asked. 3, Apolline said, without looking up from her own review. Eleanor Vance from the Magical Child Development Institute, who will speak to the developmental impact of long-term behavioral modification on a child. Cassian Moreau from the French Ministry's Enchantment Forensics team, who will speak to the technical evidence. And Augusta Longbottom. Harry looked up. Who's that? She sits on the British Wisengamot. She is not a soft woman, she is not a political woman in the usual sense, and she agreed to testify for the tribunal without, as far as I can determine, any incentive beyond the fact that she believes in doing the right thing. Apolline paused. She is terrifying and I have enormous respect for her. What will she say? What she knows. What she's observed over many years. She was a contemporary of your parents' generation, she knew people involved. Apolline finally looked at him. She's also coming because her son and daughter-in-law were attacked by Voldemort's people the same night your parents were killed. They're alive, but... A pause. She has strong feelings about what was done and not done in the aftermath. Harry absorbed this. He thought about the year 1981 and everything it had been, the night his parents died, the choices that had followed, the way one moment had created 100 downstream decisions, some of them made by Dumbledore in his office and some of them made by people Harry had never met and would never meet, and all of them adding up to an 8-year-old boy in a cupboard under the stairs who didn't know why. Okay, he said. I'm ready. He was. He knew what he wanted to say when his turn came, not testimony in the technical sense, not evidence, but what adjudicator Tanaka had said he could do if he chose, address the panel directly. He'd been writing it for 2 weeks, not as a speech but as thoughts, and then he'd stopped writing it and started just knowing it, which felt cleaner. The chamber, at full session, had a different quality from the preliminary hearings. The observer gallery was at capacity, 50 seats filled with practitioners from 12 countries, journalists with their quills, a scattering of legal observers, and in the front row, Sirius Black, who was attending every session. He was thinner than Harry wanted him to be and still had the slightly unsteady quality of someone whose internal compass was being recalibrated, but he came every day and he was present in the full sense, and he'd started, over the past 2 weeks, to look less like a man surviving and more like a man thinking. Ward was at the respondents' table with a larger British delegation today, 6 people instead of the usual 4, which Apolline had told Harry meant they were planning to push hard on the technical testimony. The British ministry had sent Cornelius Fudge. Harry had been briefed on Fudge. Apolline had described him with the economy of someone who'd assessed a person and reached a clear conclusion: a frightened man in a position that requires courage. Dangerous not because he is wicked but because he will do whatever protects him from having to be brave. He was in the gallery, not on the chamber floor, observer status only, since he wasn't a party to the proceedings, and he sat with the slightly fixed quality of a man performing relaxedness. Harry looked at him once, directly, from across the chamber when they were both finding their seats, and Fudge looked away first, which wasn't satisfying exactly but was information. Eleanor Vance testified first, and she was precise and academic and clearly furious in the specific way of someone whose professional expertise had just been asked to comment on something that made the expertise feel inadequate. She walked the panel through the developmental research on magical behavioral modification in children with the thoroughness of someone who'd published in this area and was aware that everything she said could be challenged, and she was challenged by Ward 3 times, and 3 times she answered the challenge with the calm of someone holding more ground than they were being attacked on. The key exchange came when Ward attempted to frame the enchantments as within the range of parental protective magic. Parental protective magic, Vance said, is ambient and responsive. It responds to external threats. What was placed on Mr. Potter was proactive and prescriptive. It did not protect him from external threats. It shaped his internal responses to his own world. These are categorically different in both mechanism and ethical standing. A pause. The analogy would be the difference between a parent teaching a child to swim and a parent deciding unilaterally that the child would never need to swim and surgically removing the child's ability to fear deep water. Both might be characterized as preparatory. Only one is. The chamber was very quiet. Adjudicator Osei said, "Are you characterizing the enchantments as a form of harm?" "I am characterizing them as a form of intervention that produces harm as a predictable and, based on the sophistication of the practitioner, foreseeable outcome," Vance said. Yes. Cassian Moreau's testimony was technical and dense and would not have held a room of non-specialists for the hour it took, but the room held because the details he was presenting were, in their cumulative weight, something that bypassed the technical and arrived at something simpler. He had spent 3 months analyzing the forensic documentation from Eric and Miriam's examination and building what he called, in his very precise French-accented English, the temporal map, a reconstruction of when each charm had been placed, how it had been integrated with the others, and how the overall structure had evolved across 9 years. The temporal map, displayed as a 3-dimensional projection in the center of the chamber, showed the lattice growing across the years in the soft, deliberate way of something that had been tended. Not placed all at once. Placed, and then returned to. Adjusted. Reinforced. The most recent placement 6 months ago. The one before that, 13 months ago. Regular. Maintained. The intervals, Adjudicator Tanaka said, looking at the projection. They're consistent. Approximately every 7 to 9 months, Moreau confirmed. The practitioner was monitoring and maintaining the system. This is not consistent with a one-time intervention made in a crisis context. This is consistent with ongoing management. Ward objected to the characterization. Tanaka noted the objection and asked Moreau to continue. The last placement, 6 months ago, the one that had come off first in the removal sessions, low integration, compliance reinforcement, had been placed at Hogwarts. At a meeting between Harry and Dumbledore, during which Dumbledore had apparently been discussing Harry's education options for when he turned 11. Moreau didn't dramatize this. He simply stated it as a forensic fact. The room received it as something else. Harry, in the observer gallery, thought about a meeting he had a foggy memory of, being called to Dumbledore's office at some point last summer, drinking tea that tasted slightly odd, discussing his upcoming enrollment in Hogwarts with a man who had been warm and interested and made him feel, in the specific way that trust direction enchantments were designed to produce, that this was someone to be trusted absolutely. He thought about that for a moment. Then he thought, not anymore. Augusta Longbottom was the last witness of the day, and she walked into the chamber like someone who had never in her life entered a room as anything other than its most significant occupant. She was older than Harry had expected, late 60s, he thought, with the upright quality of someone who considered physical decline a personal insult, and she wore robes the color of a winter sky and a hat that was doing something complicated and probably intentional. And she sat down in the witness chair and looked at the panel with the expression of someone who had been preparing for this specific conversation for quite some time. She was sworn in. She confirmed her name, her position, her connection to the matters under examination. Then she looked at the panel and said, before a question could be asked, "I would like to begin by saying something that is not responsive to any particular question but that I want on the record." Tanaka said, "Go ahead." "I am a member of the British Waisengamot. I have been a member of that body for 23 years. In that time I have watched the chief warlock of that body make decisions that were presented as wisdom and accepted as wisdom and questioned by no one, including myself." A pause. "I am here because a French diplomat did in one afternoon what the rest of us failed to do in 9 years, which is look at a child and ask the correct questions. I am embarrassed by that. I am not, however, going to let embarrassment prevent me from doing what I should have done considerably earlier." Ward shifted in her seat. Tanaka said, mildly, "Thank you for that preamble, Madam Longbottom. Please proceed." What followed was 90 minutes of testimony that was not dramatic in the theatrical sense. Augusta Longbottom did not weep or raise her voice, but that had the specific, devastating quality of a person with direct knowledge, good memory, and nothing left to protect, speaking clearly about what she had observed. She spoke about the immediate aftermath of Voldemort's defeat, the decisions made, who made them, who was consulted and who was not. She spoke about Sirius Black's imprisonment with the flat precision of someone who had, at the time, believed what she'd been told and was now accounting for that belief. She spoke about Harry being placed with the Dursleys, about the protective ward that Dumbledore had cited as justification, about how that justification had been accepted without challenge because challenging Dumbledore was, in the British magical world of 1981, simply not something that was done. She spoke about Neville, not as the focus of her testimony but as context, as her own experience of the same period, her son and daughter-in-law tortured to insanity while Dumbledore was elsewhere making decisions about other things. She did not accuse Dumbledore of causing that. But she placed it in the record as part of the landscape of that year. "Madam Longbottom," said Adjudicator O'Say, "in your assessment, was the decision to place Harry Potter with his Muggle relatives made because it was genuinely the best option for his welfare, or was it made because it was the most convenient option for other purposes?" A pause. Augusta Longbottom looked at the panel. She looked briefly at the observer gallery, and her eyes found Harry with the directness of someone who had looked for him specifically. "I believe," she said, "that Albus Dumbledore was and is a man of genuine conviction. I believe he made those decisions with what he understood to be the right intent. I also believe that a man of genuine conviction who is also the most powerful institutional figure in his world is a man who does not receive adequate correction when his convictions are wrong." She paused. The decisions made in 1981 about that boy's life were not the decisions of a monster. They were the decisions of a brilliant man who had decided he knew best, who was surrounded by people who agreed with him, and who had, by the time he made them, been making unchallenged decisions for so long that the habit of being unchallenged had become indistinguishable from the confidence of being right. The chamber was very still. "That," she said, "in my view, is more dangerous than malice. You can correct malice. You cannot correct wisdom that has curdled if no one in the room is willing to say that it has." She said it to the panel, but her voice carried to every corner of the chamber, and Harry, in the observer gallery, thought about the 46 pages of Dumbledore's legal response and the argument that the threat was extraordinary and therefore the methods were justified, and he thought about the old man who had looked at a 1-year-old child and decided, with absolute conviction, what that child's life was going to mean. He thought, after today, he has to come and say that here. Dumbledore arrived in Geneva on a Wednesday. Harry knew he'd arrived because Apolline told him, brisk and factual, over dinner that evening. Dumbledore had taken rooms at a hotel near the lake, had met privately with his legal team for 3 hours, and would be testifying on Friday. She told him this the way she told him all significant developments, which was directly and completely, with neither dramatization nor excessive gentling. Harry said, "Has he asked to speak with me?" "No," Apolline said. He nodded. He'd thought he might feel something specific at that news, relief or disappointment, he wasn't sure which, and instead felt mostly a kind of clarity, a clearing of atmosphere, the way the air changed before weather arrived. "Will you tell me if he does?" "Immediately," Apolline said. He didn't sleep very well Wednesday night, which was unusual for him. He'd always been a good sleeper, possibly because he'd always been tired, possibly because one of the trust direction enchantments had a secondary effect of dampening anxiety responses, which Miriam had flagged and which had become notably less dampened as more charms came off. But it wasn't anxiety keeping him awake. It was the close, dense feeling of something important about to happen, the way the air felt before thunder. Thursday he spent in the garden with Fleur, which had become their standard practice when he needed to think by moving. She ran him through magical exercises with the focused intensity of someone who was, despite herself, invested in his improvement, and he ran her through some things he'd worked out alone, and they practiced for 3 hours in the cold spring garden until both of them were warm from effort and Gabrielle had come outside to watch with her sketch pad and draw them, which they both ignored. "Are you nervous about tomorrow?" Fleur asked, during a break, sitting on the garden wall with her hands around a cup of hot tea that Henri had brought out. "About his testimony? About seeing him?" Harry thought about it. "I've been in the same room as him before. The session where Moreau testified, he was in the gallery." "I know. I mean about what it feels like." He understood what she was asking. She was asking about the specific quality of encountering the person responsible for the shape of his cage in a context where they were required to account for it. "I don't know yet," he said honestly. "I'll know after." Fleur looked at him with the expression that was her thinking face. "You could be angry," she said. Not a suggestion. More like she was offering him permission to something she'd noticed he kept very controlled. "I am angry," he said. "I have been angry for months." "You don't show it much." "Showing it doesn't do anything useful," he said. "The tribunal does something useful." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "James Potter used to get angry very loudly, apparently." "According to Sirius, yes. And it mostly didn't help." "According to Sirius, also yes." He looked at the garden wall, at the bare trees beginning to bud at their tips, the first green of them. "I think I am my own person," he said, almost to himself. "I don't actually know yet. That's what comes off last, the identity anchoring ones. I don't know who I fully am yet, apart from what was decided for me. But I know I'm not a performance. Whatever I am, it's mine." Fleur looked at him for a long moment. "You have always seemed like yourself," she said. "Even in November. Even with all of it in place. There was always something that was just you. Under all of it." He looked at her. She was watching him with the directness she always had, silver hair loose in the cold air, and she meant it completely, without softening it into something it wasn't. "Thank you," he said. "Don't make it strange," she said immediately, and turned back to her tea. He almost laughed. "I wasn't, you had a face." "I didn't have a, you had a sincere face." It was very uncomfortable. He did laugh this time, and she made a show of being put upon, and Gabrielle looked up from her sketchpad and shook her head at both of them with the particular wisdom of a 7-year-old who had decided she was the most sensible person in the garden. Friday arrived with the clean specific quality of a day that knew it was important. The chamber was at capacity before 9. The observer gallery had a waiting list, which Apolline had told Harry was unprecedented. Ward and the British delegation were at the respondents' table, and Apolline and Hestia were at the petitioner's table, and the panel was in their seats, and the air in the chamber had the dense, pre-weather feeling Harry had been carrying since Wednesday. Dumbledore walked in at 9:05. Harry had thought about what it would feel like to see him in this context. He'd thought about it concretely and carefully, the way he thought about most things now, not suppressing the thought but examining it, turning it over. Albus Dumbledore was a very old man who moved like age had been told to wait while he finished something. He was tall, robed in deep blue, his white hair and beard arranged with the deliberate tidiness of someone who understood presentation. His half-moon glasses caught the chamber light as he settled into the witness chair. He placed his hands on the table before him with the ease of someone who had been in rooms like this many times and had never not been the most significant person in them. He looked at the panel. He looked at Apolline and Hestia. He looked at the chamber. And then he looked at the observer gallery. He looked at Harry. Harry looked back. He'd thought about what he'd feel in this moment. He'd prepared for rage, or grief, or the specific hollowness of encountering someone who had shaped you and finding them smaller than the shape they'd made. He'd prepared for complicated. What he felt was simpler than any of that. It was the clarity of seeing something plainly for the first time, without the lens of the trust direction enchantments, 9 of which were still in place, though the 3 most potent had come off in February, and what he saw was a very old, very brilliant man who had looked at a child's life and seen a function, and had been so certain that was the right way to see it that the certainty had become invisible to him. He held Dumbledore's gaze without blinking and without heat. Just, steady. I see you. I'm not afraid of you. I'm not what you made me. After a moment, Dumbledore looked at the panel. Tanaka said, Mr. Dumbledore. You are here in your capacity as the individual whose magical signature has been identified as the primary contributor to the enchantment lattice documented in this proceeding. You are not at this stage under formal criminal charge, these are civil tribunal proceedings under Article 7. You have the right to have your counsel present and to decline to answer questions that might be self-incriminating under international magical law. Do you understand these rights? I do, Dumbledore said. His voice was what Harry had expected from the description, a voice that had spent 70 years being listened to, which gave it a particular resonance, a quality of expecting to fill a room. I also wish to say that I am here voluntarily and without subpoena, and that my intention is to answer the panel's questions fully and directly. Ward, beside him, looked professionally neutral in the way of an advocate who was managing an instinct to wince. Thank you, Tanaka said. Then we'll proceed. The panel's questions will be asked by Adjudicator Osei, with supplementary questions from myself and Adjudicator Brennan as needed. The petitioner's advocate will also have the opportunity to question. Is that understood? Entirely, Dumbledore said. Osei began. The first hour of questioning was methodical, establishing the factual record, the timing, the nature of each enchantment as Dumbledore understood it, his training, his qualifications, his professional history. Dumbledore answered each question with the careful precision of someone who had decided that a performance of full transparency was both strategically sound and, in some genuine sense, what the situation required. He did not deflect on the factual questions. He confirmed the placements. He confirmed the maintenance schedule. He confirmed the dates. He confirmed it all, and he confirmed it with the steady, unashamed manner of a man who had decided that what he did was defensible and who was waiting for the conversation to arrive at the defense. He didn't have to wait long. Mr. Dumbledore, Osei said, in your own words, what was the intended purpose of the enchantments placed on Harry Potter? And Dumbledore gave his answer, and the answer was, Harry had to admit, not what he'd expected. He'd expected the legal argument from Ward's document, protection, preparation, proportionality. The calibrated defense of a man who'd had months to construct it. What Dumbledore gave was something more complicated. When Voldemort was defeated in 1981, he said, I was confronted with a situation that had no precedent and no manual. A child, barely more than an infant, was the reason, the living, breathing reason, that the worst dark wizard in a century had been stopped. Not by force. Not by my intervention or anyone's intervention. By something that was either miracle or magic of a kind we don't fully understand. A pause. That child would grow up. And the thing that had been stopped, in my genuine and considered judgment, and I will not pretend that judgment was infallible, was not permanently gone. It was interrupted. And the child who had interrupted it would be its primary target when it returned. The chamber listened. I made choices, Dumbledore said, in the context of that understanding. I made choices about where Harry would live, and about what qualities he would need to survive what was coming, and about how to help him develop those qualities without burdening a child with knowledge of his own destiny before he had the capacity to carry it. He paused. I made those choices believing I was protecting him. Osei said, and the enchantments were part of that protection, Dumbledore said. As I understood it. You understood behavioral modification, capability suppression, and identity anchoring enchantments on an infant to be a form of protection. A pause. Dumbledore looked at his hands on the table. I understood them to be a form of preparation, he said. The distinction seemed important to me at the time. Does it still? A longer pause. No, he said. It does not. The chamber was very still. Ward wrote something on her parchment with the controlled haste of someone making urgent adjustments. Dumbledore looked up. He looked at the panel and his expression was, Harry watched it carefully, not the expression of a man performing regret for strategic purposes. It was the expression of a man who was, in real time, in front of people who had spent months examining the consequences of his decisions, arriving at something he'd been circling for a long time. I believed, he said, that I was building a path. I was, in fact, building a cage. I understood this at some level. I would be dishonest if I pretended otherwise, but I told myself that the cage was temporary, that it was protective rather than restrictive, that it served a purpose I understood and the boy could not yet understand. He paused. I told myself many things. Osei let the silence stand for a moment. Mr. Dumbledore, did you give consideration to alternatives? To alternatives to the enchantments? To the entirety of the approach? To placing the child with his godfather, who was alive, free, and explicitly named as guardian under his parents' will? To allowing him to grow up in the magical world with knowledge of his history? To preparation that did not require the erasure of his agency? Dumbledore looked at the table. I considered them, he said. I set them aside. Why? Because I believed, and this is the core of it, and I will not dress it in other language, I believed that I knew what was needed better than any alternative arrangement could provide. I believed that a boy who grew up knowing who he was would be shaped by that knowledge in ways that would compromise the qualities I believed he needed. A pause. I believed that what I was doing was an act of love. The words sat in the room. Apolline, at the petitioner's table, said nothing. She was watching Dumbledore with the expression of someone who has been waiting for a particular word to appear and has now heard it. Harry, in the gallery, felt something happen in his chest, not rage, not grief. Something more complex, that he didn't have a name for, that was related to the specific feeling of hearing the word love attached to the 46 pages of architectural control, the 38 filaments, the tree grown around the fence. Osei said, was it? Dumbledore said, I believed it was. I am no longer certain that what I believed was love and what love actually required of me in that situation were the same thing. Ward had stopped writing. In the gallery, Sirius Black was very still, his hands folded in his lap, his eyes on the old man in the witness chair. Tanaka said, Madame Delacour. Your questions. Apolline rose from the petitioner's table with the easy, grounded quality Harry had watched across 3 months of proceedings, no performance, no theatrics, the complete comfort of someone in the right place. She said, Mr. Dumbledore. You testified that you considered alternatives and set them aside because you believed you knew better than they could provide. My question is simple. When you placed the first enchantment on an infant in 1981, and when you returned every 7 to 9 months across the next 8 years to maintain and expand that enchantment system, at any point in those 9 years did you consult anyone, any colleague, any specialist in child development, any expert in magical ethics, about whether what you were doing was appropriate? A pause. No, Dumbledore said. Why not? Because, he said, and then stopped. He sat in the witness chair in the full-session chamber of the ICW Tribunal and he thought about his answer and something happened in his face, not collapse, not breakdown, but the very specific expression of a man who has just encountered the precise shape of a thing he's been avoiding seeing. Because, he said again, quietly, consulting others would have required me to allow that I might be wrong. And I had been in the habit of not being wrong for a very long time. Apolline looked at him for a moment. Then she said, no further questions. She sat down. The recess was 20 minutes and Harry spent it in the corridor with Sirius, both of them not quite talking, existing in adjacent silence the way they'd been learning to do over the past weeks. Sirius was not a quiet man by nature but he'd learned to be quiet in Harry's company when quiet was what Harry needed, and Harry found he appreciated it more than almost anything else Sirius did. What are you thinking? Sirius asked, after a while. That he's not lying, Harry said. Sirius was quiet for a moment. No, he said. He's not. That's the part that makes it complicated, isn't it? Yes. He did it and believed in it and none of that makes it right and none of that undoes it. No, Harry said. It doesn't. But, Sirius stopped. But it's different from what I expected, Harry said. I expected something that was easier to be simple about. This is, he thought about Dumbledore's face when he'd said the habit of not being wrong. The specific quality of a man meeting a fact about himself that he couldn't reframe. He actually arrived at something in there. I don't know if that matters. I don't know if it's enough. But it happened. Sirius looked at him. You're very measured about this. There are still 9 trust direction enchantments in place, Harry said dryly. When those come off, maybe I'll be louder about it. Sirius almost smiled, sharp and brief. James would have been through the table by now. I know. That's mostly an argument in favor of the enchantments being removed slowly. Sirius looked at him for a second, and then the almost smile became a real one, rusty and real, and Harry thought, there it is. That's what he looked like before Azkaban. I can see it from here. The recess ended. They went back in. The afternoon session was different in its energy. After Dumbledore's testimony the morning had a spent quality, like weather after rain, and the witnesses who'd been scheduled for the afternoon had been rearranged. Ward requested and received permission to present a formal statement of position from the British Ministry, which was 4 pages and argued, with diminishing confidence in its own convictions, for consideration of the exceptional circumstances and Dumbledore's long record of public service. Harry listened to it read into the record and thought about public service as a frame for the 46-page defense, and about how a man's service to the public good did not function as collateral against the specific harm done to a specific person. Then adjudicator Tanaka said, Mr. Potter has indicated a wish to address the panel. Does the panel have objections? The panel had no objections. Harry walked down from the observer gallery and across the chamber floor and stood in the center of it, not in the witness chair, which was for witnesses under examination, but simply in the open floor space of a chamber that had held 200 years of people being required to account for themselves, and he looked at the panel. He was 9 years old. He was aware that he was 9 years old. He was also aware that he was 9 years old with 12 compulsion charms removed and a new understanding of what the remaining ones were doing, and that the person standing in this chamber was already more fully himself than he'd been any previous day of his life. He said, I want to say something that's not testimony. I don't have evidence to present. I just want to say what it is, from where I'm standing. Tanaka said, Go ahead, Mr. Potter. He looked at the panel. He didn't look at Dumbledore, not because he was afraid to but because this was not for Dumbledore. This was for the record, and for the understanding of the people who would make decisions based on it. The argument for what was done to me, he said, is that the threat was real and the preparation was necessary. I'm not going to say the threat wasn't real. I think it was. I think someone was going to try to hurt me and probably will still try to hurt me, and I think the person who made those decisions was genuinely trying to prevent that. He paused. But the preparation wasn't for me. It was on me. There's a difference. The chamber was very quiet. You don't prepare a person for something by taking away their ability to choose. You don't protect someone by making them into the shape of the protection you've imagined for them. That's not preparing a person. That's preparing a function. And if the person is the wrong shape for what actually happens, if the threat turns out to be different from the one you planned for, or if the thing you needed wasn't compliance but capability, or courage, or the ability to trust people and know the trust was real, then the preparation fails and the person fails with it, and they don't even know why, because they spent their whole life feeling slightly wrong and not knowing the word for it. He stopped. He thought about what else he wanted to say. I want it known, he said, that I was never what I was made into. I don't mean that as a claim about who I am, because I'm still figuring that out. I mean that there was always something underneath the 38 charms that was its own thing, that wasn't decided by someone else. I know that because it was there even when I had all 38. Fleur Delacour told me in November that she could see it. He paused. I want that on record too. Not just the damage. Also the fact that the damage didn't do everything it was supposed to. He looked at the panel. That's what I wanted to say, he said. Thank you. He walked back to his seat. The chamber was silent for a moment, the particular silence of a room where something has just happened that everyone in it knows is going to be part of the story of this day. Sirius was looking at him from across the gallery with an expression Harry recognized now, the one that meant James and Lily together, with something entirely their own added. Apolline, at the petitioner's table, had her eyes on the panel and her hands folded before her, and she was perfectly composed, and if there was something in the set of her shoulders that was satisfaction, she kept it professional. Dumbledore, at the respondent's table, was looking at his hands. Harry sat down. Dog, who had been smuggled in by Gabrielle, who had decided tribunal proceedings were too important to miss and had engineered her attendance through mechanisms no one had fully tracked, immediately materialized from under the gallery bench and sat on his foot. He looked down at her. She looked up at him with the enormous confidence of an animal who had decided long ago that the person she'd attached herself to was worth any amount of institutional protocol. He reached down and scratched her ear, and she closed her eyes, and the March light came through the high chamber windows and lay across the floor in long pale bars, and the session continued. Chapter 5. The fracture spring arrived in Geneva the way it arrived everywhere, not all at once but in accumulation, one warm afternoon building on the last until the cold had retreated too far to return. The lake was a different color in April than it had been in February, something bluer and more convinced of itself, and the mountains still carried their snow but wore it differently, like something decorative rather than structural. Harry had been in Europe for 5 months. He thought about that sometimes, the simple fact of it, the distance between November in a phone box lift and April at a lake in Switzerland. Not sentimentally. More the way you checked a map periodically to confirm how far you traveled. He was a different distance from where he'd started than he'd realized until he looked back. The removal sessions were at 26 charms now. 12 remaining. The 3 identity-anchoring ones were still in place, those were last, always last, because their integration was the deepest and their removal required the most careful preparation. Dr. Albrecht had told him in March that she wanted to wait until the tribunal's formal proceedings were concluded before attempting the final set, on the grounds that he needed stability in his external situation while they did the most significant internal work. He'd accepted that logic because it was sound, not because he was afraid of what he'd find underneath. He wasn't afraid of it. He was curious about it, in the specific way of someone who had been developing a suspicion about their own nature for months and wanted confirmation. What he did know, after 26 removals, his magic was not ordinary. He'd known this abstractly. He knew it concretely now. The capability suppressions coming off had been the most immediately apparent change, not the gradual settling quality of the behavioral modifications unwinding, but something more like a door opening. He'd stopped being careful about it because there was no one to be careful for. He practiced in the Delacour garden and sometimes things happened that surprised Eric and Miriam and occasionally made Dr. Albrecht put down whatever she was holding. He didn't perform it. He didn't hide it. He just did what felt natural, and natural turned out to be considerable. Fleur had said, one evening in late March when he'd done something with a ward structure that she'd been trying to work out for 3 days, "You are very annoying, you know. You could just say congratulations." "I could. I won't." But she'd been watching him with the expression she used when she was recalibrating her assessment of something, and then she'd asked him to do it again, slowly, so she could follow the mechanics, and they'd spent 2 hours on it together, and both of them had ended up doing it differently than either had started. That was how they worked. Not teacher and student. 2 people who were good at different things sharpening against each other until the edges of both were better. He thought about that sometimes too. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It was delivered not by owl but by ministry courier, a formal sealed envelope bearing Dumbledore's personal seal, addressed to Harry James Potter, care of the Delacour residence, and it arrived with the morning post while Harry was eating breakfast alone because Henri had taken Fleur and Gabrielle to Orleans for the day and Apolline was in Geneva for a pre-session meeting. He looked at it for a moment. Then he opened it. It was not long. Dumbledore's handwriting was as he'd imagined, clear and deliberate, with the slight archaism of someone who'd learned penmanship in a different century. The letter said, "Dear Harry, I am writing to request a private meeting, at your convenience and in whatever location you prefer, to speak with you outside the context of the tribunal proceedings. I have no agenda I wish to conceal from your advocates. You are welcome to share the contents of this letter with Madame Delacour. My request is simply for an opportunity to speak with you directly, as the person whose life has been most directly affected by my decisions, rather than as parties to an institutional process. I understand that you have no obligation to grant this request. I am asking because I believe you deserve to hear certain things from me directly, without procedure between us. I also believe I owe it to you to ask rather than assume the answer. Yours sincerely, Albus Dumbledore." Harry read it twice. He put it on the table. He poured himself more tea and drank it slowly in thought. He thought about what Apolline would say. She would say it was his choice, which was the right answer and also not the answer he needed. He thought about what Sirius would say. Sirius would say be careful, which was Sirius's answer to most things at the moment and was understandable given the specific ways that not being careful had shaped the last 8 years of his life. He thought about what Fleur would say, which he could actually predict quite accurately at this point. She would ask what he wanted, not what was strategically optimal or emotionally safe, but what he actually wanted, and she would receive the answer without editorializing and they would proceed from there. He thought about what he wanted. He wanted to see Dumbledore outside a tribunal. He wanted to be in a room with the man without the structure of proceedings between them, because the tribunal was the right venue for accountability but it was not a conversation, and he had things he wanted to say that were not testimony and questions he wanted answers to that were not evidence, and the only way to have that was to actually have it. He was not afraid of it. That was the other thing. He sat in the Delacour kitchen with the morning light coming through the windows and examined his own internal weather carefully and there was no fear in it, and that was worth noting because the trust direction enchantments that had historically inclined him strongly toward trusting Dumbledore were significantly diminished now, which meant this feeling was not engineered. He simply was not afraid of an old man in a tribunal proceeding, and he was curious whether the old man outside of one was different. He wrote back. Mr. Dumbledore, Thursday afternoon. The café on the Rue du Rhône, the one with the blue awning, second table from the window. 3 o'clock. Come alone. Harry Potter. He sent it with the house owl and went to find something to do with his hands for the next 2 days. Apolline read the exchange that evening when she returned. She read both letters at the kitchen table while Harry watched her from across it and Fleur pretended to read a textbook 2 feet away. When Apolline finished she set the letters down and looked at him with the measuring quality she gave to things she was assessing rather than judging. You've already replied, she said. Yes. Thursday. Yes. She looked at him for another moment. All right, she said. That's it? You're not asking my permission, Harry. You're informing me. She folded the letters precisely. This is your choice and it is a reasonable one. I will tell you what I observe from a strategic standpoint, and then the choice remains yours. Is that acceptable? Yes, he said. He is going to attempt to reframe the conversation, Apolline said. Not dishonestly, I don't believe he will lie to you directly. But he will attempt to move the center of gravity from what was done to why it was done, because why is where he is most comfortable and most convincing. He is genuinely convincing when he speaks about his reasons. She paused. Be aware that being convinced by his reasons does not mean the reasons were right. I know the difference, Harry said. I know you do. She looked at him steadily. I am also aware that there are 9 trust direction enchantments still in place, which means your experience of him in person will be, not false, but not entirely free either. I know that too. He thought about it. It's like reading a document knowing it was written by someone with a bias. You don't ignore the document. You just hold it at the right distance. Fleur, not reading her textbook, said without looking up, that is a very good way of putting it. Thank you, Fleur. I wasn't complimenting you. I was acknowledging accuracy. I know, he said. You're welcome. Apolline looked between them with the expression of someone who had watched a friendship build itself over 5 months and still occasionally found its shape interesting. I will be in Geneva on Thursday, she said. I'll leave Sirius's address in case you need it. Okay, he said. Harry. She looked at him with something that wasn't quite maternal, it was too direct, too equal, for that, but was something related, something in the same family. Whatever he says, whatever he explains, you already know what you think. You have known for months. Let him speak and listen properly, and then say what you think. You don't owe him anything beyond that. He looked at her. He thought about November, a hotel in London, a lift, a question about the number. He thought about 5 months of being treated like someone whose thoughts mattered, whose questions deserved answers, whose life was his own. Thank you, he said. For all of it. She received it without embarrassment and without excessive modesty, the way she received most things, directly. The café has excellent pâtisserie, she said. Make sure you order something. Don't let him pay. Thursday was bright and cold, the spring light doing its particular thing on the Rhone, turning the water into something that looked like it had been polished. Harry arrived at the café at 10 to 3 and chose the table and ordered a hot chocolate because the pâtisserie Apolline had mentioned required it as a vehicle, and he sat by the window and watched the street and waited. Dumbledore arrived at 3 precisely. He came alone, as requested, in plain dark robes without any of the institutional insignia that had attended him in the chamber, and he looked, walking through the café door, simply like a very old man. Not diminished, his presence still had the particular quality of filling space, but without the institutional frame, more human was the word. More human in scale. He found Harry immediately, crossed to the table, and sat down with the deliberate quality of someone being careful about how they occupied space in someone else's territory. Thank you for agreeing to this, he said. Order something, Harry said. It feels odd otherwise. The faintest shift of expression, something almost amused. Dumbledore ordered tea from the waiter with the case of someone for whom ordering tea was a reflexive comfort, and when the waiter left he put his hands on the table and looked at Harry with the direct attention of someone who had decided not to perform anything. I wanted to apologize, Dumbledore said. You can, Harry said. I'd like to hear it. Dumbledore looked at him for a moment with an expression that was partly something Harry couldn't read, surprise, possibly, at the straightforwardness of the response, and then he said, I am sorry. What I did was wrong. The manner of it, the extent of it, the decision to do it without your knowledge or consent or anyone else's oversight, all of it was wrong. He paused. I want to be clear that I am saying this not as a legal statement, my counsel would probably prefer I said nothing at all, but as something I believe. I know, Harry said. I heard you in the chamber. Yes. That was real. What happened in there, when you were answering Adjudicator Osei's questions, that wasn't performance. No, Dumbledore said. It was not. Harry looked at him steadily. Outside the window, Geneva went about its Thursday afternoon. I want to ask you something, he said. Not for the tribunal. Just for me. Ask. Did you like me? Before any of this, when you were making those decisions, did I matter to you as a person? Or was I always, the function? The thing the plan required? The question sat on the table between them. Dumbledore was quiet for long enough that Harry knew he was taking it seriously rather than reaching for the easy answer. You were a baby, he said finally. I had known your parents. I had loved them, in the way that one loves people who are brilliant and brave and not yet old enough to be worn down by the world. And when I looked at you, what I felt was, he stopped. What I felt was grief, primarily. And responsibility. And the responsibility very quickly became so large that I stopped. I did not stop caring about you as a person, but I stopped experiencing you as a person clearly enough. You became, in my mind, the shape of what needed to happen. And once that happened, everything I did followed a logic that seemed sound from inside it. Harry looked at him. The grief, he said. Was that for my parents or for yourself? Dumbledore met his eyes. Both, he said, after a moment. That is an honest answer. I know, Harry said. That's why I'm asking. He picked up his hot chocolate. He let the answer settle, not agreeing with it or dismissing it, just holding it, the way Apolline had said, at the right distance. There's a prophecy, he said. It wasn't a question. A pause. Something shifted in Dumbledore's expression, not shock exactly, more the look of someone recalibrating. What makes you say that? Because the argument that you made to the tribunal, the extraordinary threat, the specific preparation, the things I needed to have or not have, it's too specific. You weren't just worried about Voldemort returning and targeting me. You were planning for something specific. A specific outcome you needed me to reach. He looked at the old man across the table. What does it say? Dumbledore was still. I'm going to know eventually, Harry said. The tribunal is going to keep pulling threads. Hestia Papadopoulos is going to keep pulling threads. Sooner or later someone is going to find it. Would you rather I hear it from a legal document or from you? The moment extended. Outside the window, the spring light moved across the Rhone. Dumbledore said, the prophecy states that a child born as the 7th month dies, with the power the Dark Lord knows not, will mark the Dark Lord as his equal. And that either must die at the hand of the other, for neither can live while the other survives. The café was warm and ordinary around them. Harry sat with it. He looked at the grain of the table for a moment, and then at his hands, and then at Dumbledore. That's why you shaped me into something expendable, he said. Not angry. Just following the logic. That is not, Dumbledore stopped. Someone who doesn't seek attention, who doesn't build their own power, who trusts authority figures and can be directed and managed and pointed at the right moment. Harry's voice was level, genuinely not performing anything. Someone who would walk into what needed to be walked into when the time came, because that's what they'd been shaped to do. He paused. The enchantments weren't just to protect me. They were to make me usable. Right? Dumbledore looked at his tea. I told myself, what did you actually do? Harry said. The question was not loud. It was very simple and very direct, and Dumbledore received it as it was meant, not as an attack but as a question that required an actual answer rather than a framing. I told myself the preparation was for your survival, he said. The preparation was also, yes, for a specific purpose I believed you would need to serve. A pause. I told myself these were the same thing. They're not, Harry said. No, Dumbledore said. They are not. Harry sat back. He looked at the old man across the table, genuinely brilliant, genuinely grieving, genuinely, in this moment, without the protective layer of his own certainty, and it was a smaller person underneath it than the certainty had suggested. Not weak. Not contemptible. Just, a man. A man who had confused his own intelligence for wisdom and his own certainty for truth, and who was now in the specific position of being required to account for that distinction in public, which was possibly the hardest thing that could happen to someone who had built a life on being the smartest person in the room. I'm going to be all right, Harry said. Not to reassure Dumbledore. As a fact. I know that now. However this ends, whatever happens next, I am going to be all right because I myself and what I actually am, without the 38 charms, is, he thought about the 10th exercise, about the capability suppressions lifting, about the ward structure Fleur had watched him do. Considerable, he said, with a certain directness that was not arrogance. I'm going to be fine. Dumbledore looked at him. I know, he said quietly. I always knew. That was never in question. I know you knew, Harry said. That's the part that stays with me. You knew what I was capable of and you spent 9 years making sure I couldn't reach it. Because you needed me to be manageable, not capable. And you called it love. The word landed. Dumbledore absorbed it without flinching, without defensive deflection, with the expression of someone taking a thing they deserved. What would you have me do? Dumbledore asked. Not a challenge. Genuinely. Harry thought about it seriously because the question deserved seriousness. Tell the Tribunal everything, he said. The prophecy. The reason for the specific shape of the enchantments. All of it. Not because I want you destroyed, I don't, particularly. But because the only way any of this means anything is if it's all in the open. Everything that was decided in private about my life in the light. That will, Dumbledore stopped. I know what it will do to your position, Harry said. I'm aware. I'm not asking you to do it because it's easy. I'm asking you to do it because it's right. He looked at the old man steadily. You said you believe what you did was wrong. Here's the thing about believing that, it comes with a next step. Dumbledore was quiet for a long time. The café moved around them, ordinary and warm, people finishing their Thursday afternoons, nobody looking at a 9-year-old boy telling one of the most powerful wizards in the world what he thought. You are remarkably like your mother, Dumbledore said, and his voice was different, quieter, a different register, something that was grief and something else together. I'll take that, Harry said. Do we have an agreement? Dumbledore looked at him. I will tell the Tribunal everything, he said. On Monday. Harry nodded. He finished his hot chocolate. He reached for his jacket. Harry, Dumbledore said. He looked up. I am genuinely, Dumbledore paused, and the pause was not strategic. I am genuinely sorry. Not for the legal record. For you. For the 9 years. For the cupboard under the stairs and the Dursleys and Sirius and all of it. I did that. I could have done differently and I chose not to. He met Harry's eyes directly, the clarity of someone who had arrived, finally, at the place where there was nothing left to defend. I am sorry. Harry looked at him for a moment. I heard you, he said. I'm not going to tell you it's fine, because it isn't fine. But I heard you. He stood up, dropped money on the table for his hot chocolate, and walked out into the spring afternoon, into the light off the Rhone, into the Geneva street and the cold and the brightness, and he walked 2 blocks before he stopped and just stood there for a moment, breathing the clear cold air and feeling the 5 months and the distance and the 12 remaining charms and everything that was still to come. He thought, not fine. But getting there. He pulled out his wand. He'd been practicing with a wand since January, which was a different experience entirely from wandless work, a different register, like the difference between speaking and singing the same thought, and he did the 10th exercise on the empty pavement, clean and easy and entirely his own, and then put the wand away and walked toward the lake. Monday arrived and Dumbledore delivered. He took the stand at 9 and he told the tribunal about the prophecy, the full text, the context, the year it was made, the reason he had kept it sealed, and he told them about the relationship between the prophecy and the specific design of the enchantment lattice, and he told them in the same steady, unperformative voice he'd used in the previous session, the voice of a man who had decided that the thing he could still control was how clearly he spoke. The chamber received it in stages, first the quiet of people absorbing new information, then the particular stillness of people realizing the implications, then the more complex quiet of people recalculating everything they'd previously understood. Ward had known it was coming, Harry suspected Dumbledore had told her over the weekend, which explained the slightly fixed quality of her expression throughout, and she did not object. There was a time when she might have. That time appeared to have passed. Hestia Papadopoulos, when the revelation about the prophecy had been fully stated and the panel had asked its initial questions, said, "Mr. Dumbledore. The enchantment design is now understood. Was the capability suppression specifically calibrated to ensure that Mr. Potter remained manageable rather than developing his full potential?" Dumbledore said, "Yes." "And the identity anchoring enchantments, were they designed to ensure that Mr. Potter would be willing, when the time came, to do whatever the prophecy seemed to require? Including, potentially, to die?" The chamber was very still. Dumbledore said, "Yes." Sirius Black, in the observer gallery, made a sound, very quiet, barely audible, but it went through the chamber the way quiet sounds did in very still rooms. He had his hands flat on the bench in front of him and he was looking at Dumbledore with an expression that was a long way past rage, something that had moved through rage into a territory that didn't have a common name. Harry, beside him, put a hand briefly on Sirius's forearm. Sirius looked at him. Harry looked back. I know. Stay here." Sirius breathed out, slow and deliberate, and put his eyes back on the chamber. Tanaka said, "The panel will take a 30-minute recess." In the corridor, nobody spoke for a while. Sirius leaned against the wall with his arms folded and his eyes closed and his jaw doing something tight, and Harry stood beside him and didn't try to fill the silence with anything because it didn't need filling. After a while Sirius said, "He designed you to die." "He designed me to be willing to," Harry said. "If the prophecy required it. There's a difference. I think he believed I'd survive. I think the enchantments were partly to make sure I'd make the choice if survival wasn't available." Sirius stopped. "Tried again." "Harry, I know," Harry said. "Are you?" "I'm not nothing," Harry said. "I'm not fine, exactly, but I'm not nothing. I knew something like this when I read the response document in December. The specific shape of the identity anchoring ones, expendable was the word Eric used. I'd been sitting with that for a while." Sirius opened his eyes. He looked at Harry with the raw, unguarded expression he showed sometimes in unguarded moments, the expression that was James and Lily and 8 years of Azkaban and everything that had been taken and was being slowly, incompletely returned, and underneath all of it something that was specifically for Harry, a specific quality of feeling that was still finding its form. "You're 10 years old," Sirius said. "9, Harry corrected. "You're 9 years old and you're handling this better than I am." "You've been in Azkaban for 8 years, Harry said. "I think you get slightly more latitude on the handling scale." Sirius looked at him for a moment. Then, with the quality of something being said very carefully because it mattered, "Your parents would have," he stopped. Started again. "They would have been so proud of you." I'm not saying it to make you feel better. I'm saying it because it's true and you deserve to know it." Harry looked at the Geneva corridor wall and thought about that. He didn't dismiss it. He held it properly, the way it was meant. "Tell me about them sometime," he said. "Not the important story. The ordinary things. What James thought was funny. What Lily did when she was thinking hard." He paused. "I want to know who they were." Sirius looked at him. "Yeah," he said quietly. Yeah, I can do that. The 30 minutes ended. They went back in. The political fallout began before the session ended. Fudge had been in the gallery throughout and he left 10 minutes before the recess concluded. Apolline noted it with the precise attention of someone who had been watching for exactly that movement. His delegation followed him in a cluster that had the energy of people being given instructions at speed. That evening, the British ministry issued a formal statement through official channels expressing full confidence in the magical institutions of Great Britain, concern at the scope of international judicial overreach in domestic matters of national security, and commitment to a thorough internal review of matters pertaining to the boy who lived. It named no names and expressed no support for Dumbledore and managed, in 3 paragraphs, to simultaneously defend the principle of his actions while completely abandoning the man. Apolline read it at dinner and described it as the political equivalent of someone setting your house on fire and handing you a pamphlet about fire prevention. Sirius, who had been eating dinner at the Delacour house with increasing frequency since his release, said, "Fudge has been calculating how to survive this since February. He's decided Dumbledore is the one who doesn't get to walk away clean." "He won't get away clean either," Apolline said. "The ICW has questions about ministry conduct during the period, what was known, when it was known, why no inquiry was initiated domestically. Those questions are going to be answered." "He'll claim he didn't know," Sirius said. "He may not have known the specific details," Apolline allowed. "He knew enough to be concerned when I walked into that ministry reception in November. He asked me specifically whether there was a concern, which means he had a pre-existing sensitivity about the subject." Harry was eating and listening with his full attention. "He'll try to make Dumbledore the whole story," he said. "One man acting on his own. Not institutional. Not systematic. One brilliant man who went too far, who is accountable, and who the system is now appropriately addressing." Everyone at the table looked at him. "It keeps the system clean," he said. "If it's just Dumbledore, then the Wisengamot is fine, the ministry is fine, the ICW is mostly fine. The whole apparatus continues because the problem was one person, not the structure that let one person do this unchecked for 9 years." Henri put his fork down. "That is a very clear-eyed analysis." "It's also what they're going to do," Harry said. "And I don't think we can stop them from doing it entirely. But we can make sure it's on record that it was structural. That the lack of oversight was structural. That a system that allowed this was itself part of the problem." He looked at Apolline. "That's something the tribunal can address, right? In the findings?" Apolline looked at him with the measuring quality she used when she was deciding whether he'd just surprised her. "Yes," she said. "The panel can make structural recommendations as part of the ruling. I had intended to request that." A pause. "I'll want your input on the specific language." "Good," he said, and returned to his dinner. Fleur, across the table, was watching him with the expression she used when he'd done something she was recalibrating her assessment around. He glanced at her. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "Fleur. You are occasionally alarming," she said, "and I mean that as a compliment." "Thank you," he said. It was not entirely a compliment. "I know," he said. "You're welcome." Gabrielle, at the end of the table, was drawing the whole scene with the comprehensive thoroughness of someone who decided to document everything. She had been drawing since November. She had, by April, produced something approaching a visual history of the tribunal proceedings, the Delacour household, the Geneva sessions, Harry practicing in the garden, Sirius looking out windows, and dogs sitting on various surfaces with the authority of someone who had never been told she wasn't allowed. Several of the drawings were genuinely very good. After dinner, Harry found Sirius on the terrace, which had become Sirius's thinking place, open sky, which Harry understood was what you wanted after 8 years of stone ceiling. "Can I ask you something?" Harry said. "Always," Sirius said, and he said it with the simplicity of someone who decided it was always going to be that answer. "When this is finished, the tribunal, the rulings, all of it. What then? For you, I mean." Sirius leaned on the railing and looked at the dark garden. I'm getting my house back. Technically. The family house in London. He made a face. It's going to require a substantial amount of everything. The place is, it's a monument to everything I spent my entire adolescence trying to leave behind. But you'll have it. I'll have it. He paused. And you'll have custody options. That's coming in the tribunal ruling. Your legal guardianship situation is being formally addressed. You don't have to go back to the Dursleys. He glanced at Harry sideways. Apolline's already drafted the paperwork to make me your official guardian. If you want that. Harry looked at the dark garden. Do you want that? He said. Yes, Sirius said, without any hesitation at all, and the lack of hesitation was itself significant, because Sirius was a man who'd spent 8 years with hesitation as a survival strategy and he'd discarded it entirely on this particular question. Then yes, Harry said. Obviously yes. Sirius breathed out slowly. He looked at the sky for a moment, the spring stars above the garden, and Harry watched him receive the answer and hold it, the way you held something you'd been careful not to hope for too concretely. One more thing, Harry said. The prophecy. Neither can live while the other survives. What do you think about that? Sirius turned to look at him. I think, Harry said, that a prophecy tells you what will happen, not how. It tells you the outcome of a specific kind of confrontation. It doesn't tell you anything about the person who walks into that confrontation or what resources they bring to it. He looked at Sirius steadily. Dumbledore managed that situation by trying to make me small enough to be used. I have a different idea. What idea? Sirius said. Being exactly as capable as I actually am, Harry said. Being honest about it, being prepared, doing it with people around me rather than alone and uninformed. Meeting whatever's coming as myself rather than as the function someone else designed. He paused. The prophecy says neither can live while the other survives. That's fine. I intend to survive. I'm very good at it. Sirius looked at him. Merlin, he said softly. You're going to be terrifying when you're grown. I'm fairly terrifying now, Harry said, apparently, and Sirius laughed, a real laugh, full and unguarded, the kind that sounded like it had been waiting in him for years, and above the garden the spring stars did their ancient, indifferent burning, and Harry stood on a terrace in France at the beginning of knowing who he was, and thought that considerable was not a bad thing to be. The ICW vote was scheduled for the last Friday of April. In the 3 weeks between Dumbledore's full testimony and the vote, the tribunal produced its draft findings, a document of 62 pages that Apolline and Hestia had shaped with the precision of people who understood that this document would be read for decades. It found that Harry Potter had been subject to sustained, deliberate magical manipulation constituting harm under Article 7. It found that the manipulation had been designed with specific intent, maintained over 9 years, and connected to a pattern of decision-making that extended beyond the immediate subject to include the wrongful imprisonment of Sirius Black and the deliberate suppression of information pertaining to Harry Potter's legal guardianship. It found that the British Ministry of Magic had failed in its duty of oversight, through a combination of institutional deference and deliberate incuriosity that fell below the standard required of a signatory to the Accords of 1963. It recommended structural reforms including mandatory external review of decisions made under prophetic or extraordinary circumstance classifications. It made specific recommendations regarding Dumbledore's positions, removal from the Supreme Mugwump role, with a finding that his continued occupation of the Chief Warlock position was a matter for the British Wisengamot to address in light of the findings. And it ordered the completion of the charm removal process under certified supervision, with quarterly welfare review by the ICW's Child Protection Division for a period of 3 years. Harry read the draft document in the delegation room the Thursday before the vote, alone, because he'd asked to read it alone first. He read all 62 pages and then sat for a while. He thought about 38 filaments. He thought about an astrolabe model in a hotel sitting room. He thought about Geneva in winter and Fleur with a sandwich at the ministry and Sirius through a glass in a courtroom and a café on the Rue du Rhône in spring. He thought about the fact that the draft document used the word harm 37 times, which meant something specific legally, and about the fact that he'd been asked, by Apolline, whether he wanted to add a personal statement to the findings as an appendix. He opened his notebook. He found the page from December where he'd written about trees and fences and knowing your own shape. He read it back. He added, at the bottom, the cage is coming off. What was underneath it was there all along. That's the most important thing I can say for the record, not the damage, not the grief, not even the anger, though all of those are real. The most important thing is that nothing that was put on me succeeded in making me into something I wasn't. I was always here. And I'm still here. That's worth knowing. He closed the notebook and looked at the alpine light through the delegation room window and thought, one more day. Chapter 6. The weight lifted. The morning of the vote came in like any other April morning, which Harry thought was either deeply appropriate or deeply strange, that a day which was going to matter could look so ordinary from the outside. The lake was doing its blue thing, the mountains were doing their white thing, the Geneva streets were full of people who had no idea that in 3 hours an international body was going to vote on the consequences of a choice made when Harry had been 14 months old. He ate breakfast with everyone. That was what he wanted, and that was what happened. Apolline and Henri and Fleur and Gabrielle at the Delacour house kitchen table, with Sirius who had come the night before and slept in the guest room and appeared at breakfast with his hair doing approximately 7 things and a quality of suppressed anxiety that he was managing with the controlled effort of a man who'd recently rediscovered how to care about outcomes. Dog was on Harry's foot. Gabrielle was drawing. Fleur was eating with the focused efficiency of someone who had opinions about how the day was going to go and had decided not to express all of them until the appropriate moment. Henri made eggs and put bread on the table and poured coffee for the adults and said nothing dramatic, which was exactly right, because Henri had the quality of knowing when a room needed the ordinary and providing it without announcement. "What time do we leave?" Sirius asked. 8:30, Apolline said. "The vote begins at 10. Panel deliberation concludes today, they've been in final session since Wednesday." "How long does the vote take?" "The findings are read first, which will be approximately 40 minutes. Then the formal vote. Then the rulings." She set down her coffee. "We should be finished by early afternoon." "And then?" Sirius said. Apolline looked at Harry. Harry was eating toast and looking at the garden through the window where the plane trees were finally, 5 months after he'd first seen them bare, doing something green at their tips. He said, without looking away from the trees, "And then we finish the removals. And then we go home." He paused. "Wherever that is." "London," Sirius said, with a certainty that Harry felt rather than heard. "Eventually. When the house is fit for humans, which it is currently not, but which I have people working on." A pause. "And France when you want it." "Apolline has already, I know," Harry said. He looked at Sirius. "I know." He meant it as more than acknowledgement. Sirius received it as more than acknowledgement. Fleur said, to no one in particular, "I think the vote will be 12-3. Everyone looked at her. She looked back with the expression of someone who had done the calculation and was stating the result. 12-3, she repeated. "The Scandinavian bloc is solid. Director Amati is solid. The French delegation obviously. The Italian and Spanish members have been favorable in their questioning. The holdouts are the 2 British sympathetic members and one of the Eastern European seats who has been quiet throughout, which means either undecided or strategically uncommitted, and I believe strategically uncommitted means they'll abstain rather than vote against, which gives us 12 confirmed with the possibility of 13. There was a brief silence. Henri said, "She's been tracking the panel." "Obviously," Fleur said. Harry looked at her. She looked at him with the composure of someone who had decided this was entirely reasonable and was unmoved by the suggestion otherwise. He thought about November, a 12-minute elevator conversation, a girl who'd noticed a man with an upside-down pamphlet and a political reception's wine selection and said, within the first 3 minutes of their acquaintance, that he looked like he'd rather not be here. 12-3, he said. I trust your math. You should, she said. They arrived at the ICW building at 8:20 and the atmosphere was different from any previous session, not louder, but denser, the way air felt before something broke in it. The corridors had more people than usual, standing in clusters that had the focused quality of people waiting for news rather than people going about their business. The press presence in the outer halls was significant, quills, notebooks, the particular alert quality of reporters who knew they were about to have a story. Harry walked through it with Apolline on one side and Sirius on the other and Fleur slightly behind, and he was aware of being looked at, openly, in a way that was different from the looks he'd been getting since November, which had been the looks of people trying to work out who the 9-year-old at the center of the proceedings was. These were different. These were the looks of people who had been following a story for 5 months and were now looking at the person the story was about in the hours before it resolved. He didn't duck his head. He didn't put on anything particular either. He just walked, and looked at people when they looked at him, and did not perform anything in either direction. In the corridor outside the main chamber, Hestia Papadopoulos was waiting. She had the look of someone who had been awake since very early and had no complaints about it. She fell into step with Apolline and they had a brief, rapid exchange in French that Harry followed. Panel had concluded deliberation at 7, findings were finalized, vote was proceeding as scheduled, Ward had filed a last-minute procedural objection that had been dismissed in under 10 minutes. Any surprises in the findings? Apolline asked. 1, Hestia said. They added language about the prophecy. Specific language about the ethical status of decisions made regarding minors based on prophetic information, what the duty of transparency requires, what the limits of unilateral decision-making are in such contexts. It's new. It'll be precedent. Apolline absorbed this. That's the structural reform language. And more than that, Hestia said. It names the specific failure as the assumption of authority over a life based on predicted significance. It says the significance of what a child might become does not transfer decision-making authority over what they are now to anyone other than their appropriate guardian. A pause. It's good law. Harry said, good. Both women looked at him. He looked back. It is good law, he said. Someone should have written it 60 years ago. Hestia looked at him with an expression he'd seen on her before, the specific expression of a person who had been doing child protection work for 20 years and occasionally encountered something that cut through the professional layer and landed somewhere more personal. Yes, she said. They should have. The main chamber had the quality of a theater before a curtain, the gallery full, the press bench full, every seat taken and the walls lined with people who'd come anyway. The 5-member panel took their seats at 9:58, and the chamber settled into the specific silence of a large room that has decided it's going to pay attention. Harry was in the front row of the observer gallery. Sirius to his left, Apolline to his right. Fleur beside Apolline. Henri had stayed with Gabrielle at the hotel, which Gabrielle had objected to until Henri had pointed out that someone needed to ensure Dog didn't eat the remaining pâtisserie, at which point Gabrielle had accepted the assignment with the gravity it deserved. Adjudicator Tanaka called the session to order. She read the findings. It took 43 minutes. Harry listened to every word. He had read the document twice but listening was different, hearing the formal language of a legal finding read aloud in a chamber full of people who were recording it, absorbing it, understanding that this was the record, this was what it said and it would keep saying it indefinitely. There was weight in the hearing of it that the reading had not quite carried. He listened to the finding of harm. He listened to the finding of deliberate design. He listened to the structural failure language. He listened to the prophetic circumstances precedent, which was new and clean and would, as Hestia said, be law. He listened to his own name read into findings 29 times and he thought about Privet Drive and thought about the cupboard and thought about November and let all of it be exactly what it was, not minimized, not dramatized, just accurately present. When Tanaka finished reading, she set the document down and looked at the chamber. The panel will now vote on the adoption of these findings and the rulings as stated therein, she said. The vote requires a simple majority. The panel consists of 5 members. A vote of 3 or more constitutes adoption. Harry thought, 5 members, not 15. Fleur had been tracking the wider ICW vote that would happen afterward, the formal institutional ratification. But this panel vote was the immediate one. Panel member Osei, Tanaka said. In favor, Osei said. Panel member Brennan. In favor. Panel member Vasquez. A brief pause, the first. In favor. Panel member Lindqvist. In favor. Panel member Tanaka, Tanaka said, and the slight quality in her voice of someone doing a thing they've been preparing for. In favor. 5-0. The chamber did not erupt. It did something else, a collective exhale, a change of pressure, the specific sound of a large room full of people recognizing that something real had just happened. Not celebration, not exactly. More like the sound of a held breath released. Sirius, beside Harry, had his eyes closed and his hands flat on the bench. Apolline was very still. Harry looked at the panel. He thought, it's done. He thought, not all of it, not the charms, not the recovery, not whatever comes next, but this part. This part is done. Tanaka called for order with minimal effort, the room had mostly ordered itself. The findings are adopted, she said. The rulings are in effect as of today. The ICW formal ratification vote will proceed at 2 o'clock this afternoon in the General Assembly chamber. She looked up from her notes and looked at the observer gallery, found Harry with the same directness she'd had the first time she'd looked at him, in the preliminary hearing, months ago. Mr. Potter. These proceedings are concluded. The rulings include provisions for your ongoing welfare review and for the completion of your charm removal process. You will receive formal documentation of all rulings within 24 hours. She paused, and what she said next was not the practiced language of an adjudicator finishing a session, it was something else, something more direct. I want to say for the record, and speaking personally rather than in my official capacity, that the manner in which you have participated in these proceedings, your clarity, your honesty, and your very considerable composure, has been exceptional by any standard, and that this institution is better for having been compelled to act. She closed her folder. Session concluded, she said. The corridor afterward was full and loud and everyone wanted to speak to Apolline, and Hestia and Ward was making her way through the crowd with the practiced efficiency of someone heading for an exit, and Sirius had stood up from the bench and was standing in the middle of it all with the particular expression of a man who had been closed in a very small space for a very long time and was remembering what open felt like. Harry found a slightly less crowded section of wall near a window and stood there and let the post-session noise flow around him and thought, 12 remaining charms. He could feel them, or he'd learned to feel them, over months of gradual removals, the way you learn to feel a thing once someone had told you it was there. 9 trust direction ones and 3 identity anchoring ones, and the identity anchoring ones were the ones he thought about most, the deepest integrated, the oldest, the ones that had been there so long they had participated in the construction of how he understood himself. He was curious about what was underneath them in a way that was entirely clean. No fear. Just curiosity. Fleur appeared beside him, coming from the direction of the chamber doors. 12-3, she said. He looked at her. The full ICW vote isn't until this afternoon. The panel was 5-0, she said, with slight emphasis. Fleur. I was close, she said. The underlying analysis was correct. I underestimated the panel's unanimity. Or overestimated the holdouts. Those are the same thing expressed differently. I know, he said. That's why I said it. She looked at him with the expression that was always slightly between exasperated and something warmer, and she said, Are you all right? Not the way people usually asked it, the slightly anxious, slightly performing way, where the asker needed a particular answer. The way Fleur asked things, directly, expecting a real answer, prepared to receive it. Yes, he said. And then, because it was her, also no. Also both. It's a lot of things at once. Yes, she agreed, simply. I keep thinking about the last three, he said. The identity anchoring ones. I think about who I'm going to be when those come off. Whether I'll be different. Do you want to be different? I want to be more, he said. More of whatever I actually am. Not different. More. She looked at him carefully. You have always been more, she said. I told you in November. There was always something under it that was entirely yours. He knew she'd said it before. It landed differently now, in the post-vote corridor with the findings just read and the rulings in effect and 12 charms remaining on their way to none. You've been, he started. These 5 months have been, he stopped, which was unusual for him, he generally found words with ease. I don't know how to say it. Don't, then, Fleur said, with the brisk practicality of someone who found excess sentiment uncomfortable but was clearly not unmoved by what was not being said. It doesn't need saying. It does, actually, he said. I'm saying it badly, but it does. She looked at him. You were the first one, he said. Before Apolline explained anything, before the examination, before any of it, you were standing at a refreshments table in the British Ministry and you talked to me like I was worth talking to, and then you told me the truth about what your mother had sensed, and then you said come on as if it was obvious I was coming and obvious I belonged wherever you were going. He looked at her steadily. That was the first time in my life anyone had done that. The obvious version. Not making a choice about me but just, assuming I was there. Fleur was very still. So, he said. Thank you. She looked at him for a moment, and then she said, with the precision of someone choosing carefully, you were worth talking to. That was not difficult to see. I know that now, he said. Good, she said. There was a beat. Also, she said, you were terrible at navigating the refreshments table and someone needed to assist. I was perfectly capable of navigating. You were going to take the watercress sandwiches. The watercress ones were fine. They were not fine, Harry. They were, he stopped because she was doing the almost smile, the door opening a fraction one, and he thought he'd learned to read most of her expressions by now but this one still caught him slightly off guard, possibly because it was reserved for moments she didn't particularly want you to know she was having. They were fine, he said again, less certainly. They were not, she said, and walked back toward the crowd, and he followed her, which was how it went. The ICW General Assembly ratification vote was 13-2 at 2 o'clock that afternoon, which made Fleur's original prediction nearly correct and which she accepted as sufficient vindication without commentary. The 2 dissenting votes were cast by the British sympathetic members Fleur had identified, and the Eastern European abstention turned into a yes, and the findings and rulings were formally ratified by the full international body and entered into the permanent record of the Confederation. Dumbledore's removal from the Supreme Mugwump position was effective immediately. The question of his chief warlock position was referred formally to the British Wisengamot, along with the panel's findings, with a recommended timeline of 30 days for the domestic body to address. Harry was not in the Assembly chamber for the ratification vote. He was in a small park near the lake with Sirius, feeding bread to aggressive geese, which was what Sirius had suggested doing when Harry had said he didn't want to sit in another chamber for the afternoon and Sirius had said he didn't either, and Henri had arranged the bread. How are you feeling? Sirius asked. They'd been at this for 20 minutes and the geese had become emboldened and were now essentially running the park. You asked me that this morning, Harry said. I'm asking again. Things have changed since this morning. Harry thought about it. The geese were doing something organized and slightly threatening near the bench. Like I finished something, he said. And also like everything that comes next is just starting. He paused. And the geese are a problem. The geese are absolutely a problem, Sirius agreed. We should leave. We should leave. They left, pursued briefly by geese, which was not the dignified exit either of them would have chosen on a significant day but which turned out to be the most useful possible thing because it made both of them laugh helplessly for about 30 seconds, the kind of laughing that doesn't know what it is exactly, relief and absurdity and something that was the specific release of a thing that's been held for a long time finally letting go. They walked along the lake in the April afternoon and talked about ordinary things, Grimmauld Place, which Sirius described as requiring a full exorcism, possibly several, and at minimum a structural survey because the house has been holding opinions for 30 years and they're dark opinions. About Harry's enrollment at Hogwarts in September, which was proceeding, there had been considerable institutional rearrangement around Hogwarts's management given the findings, with McGonagall currently serving as acting head and a new appointment pending, and Harry had a meeting scheduled with the Board of Governors in June. About Quidditch, which Sirius had started to introduce him to with the evangelist's zeal of someone who has decided this is important and is not taking no for an answer and is mostly getting yes anyway. About James and Lily. The ordinary things, the way Harry had asked. Sirius talked about them the way you talked about people when you knew them rather than their legend, James who had been genuinely funny in a way that was occasionally unkind and was working on that, Lily who had been the most precise thinker Sirius had ever met and also the first person to tell him directly that he was running away from himself rather than toward anything and who had been right. The four of them in their last year at Hogwarts, the specific quality of being young and powerful and unaware of how close everything was to changing. Harry listened and stored it and thought, I am the child of specific people. Not symbols. People. The final removals were scheduled across 3 sessions in early May. Dar. Albrecht did the last 9 trust direction enchantments over 2 sessions, and Harry experienced the removal of each one the way he'd been experiencing all the removals for months, not dramatically, but with the distinctive quality of something shifting in how the world sat relative to himself. The trust direction ones had the most complex experiential component because they were about relationship rather than behavior or capability. Each one that came off changed the texture of how he felt about specific people and specific institutions, not radically, because some of his genuine feelings were broadly consistent with the directed ones, but with more resolution. His trust, when it returned after each removal, felt earned rather than installed. He found, after the last trust direction one came off, that his genuine assessment of people was, Apolline and her family, deeply serious, absolutely. Hestia, professionally and personally. Eric and Miriam, with the specific warmth you felt for people who'd done delicate, careful work on your behalf. Dumbledore, and this was the one he'd been most uncertain about, something complicated and not resolved, that was real anger and real acknowledgement of the genuine quality of the man simultaneously and was not required to be simpler than it was. And Fleur, whose category was its own. The identity-anchoring enchantments were the last. Dr. Albrecht had prepared him for these with more care than any other set. They'd talked through what to expect across 2 preparatory sessions, the feeling of integration being reversed, the possible disorientation as the identity frame they'd provided was removed, the importance of not trying to force a new self-understanding immediately but letting it settle. Your genuine identity has been present throughout, she'd said. The enchantments anchored a specific frame over it. What you'll experience when they come off is not the construction of something new. It's the removal of a layer that was over something that was always there. I know, he'd said. You'll feel it more acutely than you expect, she'd warned. Okay, he'd said. She was right. The first of the 3 came off on a Thursday morning and Harry sat in the chair in the examination room and the world stayed the same but he didn't, in the specific sense that the internal voice that had been saying you are unimportant, you are unremarkable, you are best suited for specific purposes decided by others, a voice so constant and structural that he hadn't even identified it as distinct from his own thoughts, went silent, and the absence of it was more striking than any of the previous removals had been. He sat in the chair for a while. Miriam was monitoring. She asked, "What are you experiencing?" "Quiet," he said. "Internal quiet." He thought about it more carefully. "I keep waiting for the voice that says I'm not worth much to say something and it's not there." "Good," Miriam said, and she said it with the same warmth she'd used the first time he'd mentioned the security gap in the room, and he felt the same thing he'd felt then, the specific experience of a competent person being pleased at his competence. The second came off the following Tuesday. This one was older, more integrated, and its removal had the quality of a structural shift, not painful but immediately apparent, like a weight redistributed. What he felt afterward was harder to articulate, something more spatial, more capacious. A sense of available room in himself that hadn't been there. He sat with it for a long time after the session, in the garden at the Delacour house, with the May evening coming in green and warm and dog on his lap, and he thought, this is what being completely in yourself feels like. It's larger than I expected. He thought, I can work with this. The third and final enchantment came off on a Friday afternoon in the second week of May. It was the oldest. The one laid when he'd been 14 months old. The one that had been there so long it had participated in the formation of everything above it, that had been foundation rather than frame, and its removal required an additional specialist in the room and took almost 2 hours rather than the usual 30 to 40 minutes, and it was, not painful, but the most intensely physical of all the removals. A deep whole-body experience that Dr. Albrecht had described as similar to a long-held muscle finally releasing. When it was done, Harry sat in the chair and breathed. Dr. Albrecht said, "How are you?" He took stock. He looked inward with the careful, practiced attention he developed over 6 months of this process, and he looked at what was there. What was there was himself. Just himself. No frame, no architecture, no borrowed structure. Just, this. The thing that had been there under all of it, that Fleur had seen in November, that had been pushing back against 38 charms his entire life with the patient, uncelebrated persistence of something that simply refused to be entirely overridden. He thought, this is who I am. He thought, oh. Yes. This is who I am. I'm good, he said, and the simplicity of it, the genuine, uncomplicated truth of it, surprised him slightly, and then didn't. They had dinner in Geneva that evening, the whole group, Apolline and Henri and Fleur and Gabrielle, Sirius and Hestia, Eric and Miriam and Dr. Albrecht, and adjudicator Osei who had become, over the course of the proceedings, something that existed in a category between professional and personal for Apolline, and who had accepted the dinner invitation with the directness of someone who decided the occasion warranted crossing the professional line. The restaurant was on the lake. The May evening was warm enough for the terrace and they were on the terrace, and the Alps were doing their white thing on the horizon and the lake was its evening blue, and everyone who had been part of this thing for 6 months was at one long table with wine and food and the specific quality of a group of people who have done something difficult together and are now allowed to be somewhere that isn't the middle of it. Hestia made a toast that was characteristically unembellished, to better law, she said. And to the people who make it necessary and the people who make it happen. Everyone drank. Gabrielle, who was at the table because she was always at the table and because she had produced, over 6 months, a visual record of the tribunal proceedings that was genuinely extraordinary for a 7-year-old, presented Harry with the drawing she'd been working on for the past week. It was the garden at the Delacour house, Harry practicing with his wand, Fleur watching with her arms crossed and her thinking face on, dog at Harry's feet, the bare plane trees behind them from early in their time there, and Gabrielle had somehow captured something true in it, not photographic truth but the kind of truth that came from a child drawing what she actually saw rather than what she thought she was supposed to show. It was very good. Thank you, Harry said. He held it carefully. This is one of the best things I've ever been given. Gabrielle looked at him with her frank assessment. I know, she said. I made it well. You did, he said. I'm going to be a great artist, she said. Yes, he agreed. I think so too. She seemed satisfied with this and returned to her food. Sirius, across the table, was watching with the specific expression he used when Harry did something with children that revealed something about him, easy, natural, without the slight self-consciousness that showed up in adult interactions sometimes. It was an expression Sirius had mentioned, once, that James had had with small children, that particular lack of condescension that came from genuinely not feeling superior. Harry caught the expression and Sirius looked away with the transparency of someone who hadn't quite managed to school his face in time. After dinner, when the table had settled into the easy, unstructured conversation of the later evening, and Gabrielle had fallen asleep against Henry's arm and dog had materialized from under the table for the inevitable terrace surveillance, Harry found himself at the railing with Fleur, looking at the lake in the dark. "Last night in Geneva," she said. "For now," he said. "There'll be welfare reviews." "Quarterly," she agreed. "Which is at least 4 times a year. I'll have to watch you navigate institutional settings with that expression you get." "What expression?" "The one that says you are paying more attention than anyone in the room, and you would like them to be aware of this, but you will not say so because you have decided patience is more effective." He looked at her. "That's very specific." "You have it often," she said. "I've had time to study it." 6 months, he said. "Yes." He looked at the dark lake. "What happens in September?" he said. "When I'm at Hogwarts and you're at Beauxbatons," she said. "Yes. We've thought about this." "And?" She looked at the lake. "Letters," she said. "Portkeys when relevant. Holidays." She paused. "I assume you will learn things at Hogwarts that you want to discuss, and I will learn things at Beauxbatons that I want to discuss, and we will discuss them, and you will be wrong about some of them and I will correct you." "And the ones where you're wrong?" he said. "Theoretically possible," she said, with the slight elevation of tone that meant she was performing being serious about something she wasn't serious about. "I suppose we would address those too." "Theoretically." "Yes." He looked at the mountains in the dark. "I've been thinking about who I am," he said. "Now that it's all off. What I find when I look." "And," she said. Not rushed, not leading, just open, the way she was when the question mattered. "Someone who pays attention," he said. "Someone who doesn't flinch from difficult things but isn't reckless about them either. Someone who cares about honesty more than comfort. Someone who likes people who are real." He paused. "Fairly powerful and not particularly interested in pretending otherwise. Curious about almost everything." He thought about the drawing Gabrielle had given him, the garden, Fleur with her arms crossed. "I like teaching." "I didn't know that." "I noticed," she said. "You're good at it." "I like doing things alongside people more than doing them alone." He paused. "I think I'm loyal to a degree that might become inconvenient," Fleur supplied. "I was going to say intense." "Same thing," she said. "It's one of your better qualities." He looked at her. She was watching the lake with the profile that was silver in the dark, and he thought about November, and he thought about May, and he thought about the 7 months in between, and he thought, "I didn't know this person existed, and now I can't imagine the landscape of my life without her in it," which is its own kind of astonishing. "I'm going to be okay," he said. Not to her specifically. Just aloud, to the night, to the lake and the mountains and the dark above them. "Yes," Fleur said. "Obviously." "Obviously," he agreed. "You were always going to be okay," she said. The question was just when and how and whether anyone was going to help. She looked at him. The answer turned out to be, my mother, sensing things. At a ministry reception. At a terrible ministry reception with terrible sandwiches. The sandwiches were, Harry, she said, with the absolute certainty of someone who has held this position for 6 months and will hold it indefinitely, the sandwiches were terrible. He looked at her for a moment. "Fine," he said. The sandwiches were terrible. She turned back to the lake with an expression of complete satisfaction, the door-opening smile there and real and not going away this time, and he looked at it and thought, that's the version she doesn't manage. That's the one that's entirely hers. He looked back at the lake. In June, Harry sat in a meeting with the Hogwarts Board of Governors, 7 people around a table in London, with McGonagall at the head of it and a new energy in the room that came from an institution being required to examine itself. He answered their questions with the directness that was his now, entirely his, not produced by any charm or any external pressure, and he asked his own questions about curriculum and about the new oversight structure and about what changes the board intended to make to the pastoral systems that had, among other things, failed to flag the conditions of his life with the Dursleys for 9 years. They were slightly taken aback by the questions. He waited, without apparent concern, for them to recover and answer. McGonagall, across the table, watched him with an expression that was complex and entirely human, guilt and recognition and something that was respect with no performance in it. After the meeting, she stopped him in the corridor. She looked at him for a moment with the directness of someone who had decided not to deliver the easier version of what she was going to say. "I owe you an apology," she said. "Not on behalf of the institution. Personally. I am a person who prides herself on seeing children clearly, and I did not see you clearly. I deferred to Albus in ways I should not have deferred, and the cost of that deferral was your first 9 years." Her voice was steady, but it was doing something underneath the steadiness. "I am sorry." He looked at her. He thought about the 62 pages and about testimony and about what Augusta Longbottom had said, a man of genuine conviction, surrounded by people who agreed with him. "I know," he said. "I accept it." He meant both things, that he understood, and that the apology was received. "Are you staying on as head?" "Acting head until September," she said. "The board has offered me the permanent position. Will you take it?" She looked at him. "I haven't decided." "You should," he said. "You know what went wrong. You'll do it differently." He paused. "I'd rather have you there than someone who doesn't know the shape of the failure." She looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't fully read, except that it was not patronizing and not performative and was, in some specific way, the expression of a person being spoken to as a peer by someone who was 9 years old and not finding it strange. "I'll consider it," she said. He nodded. He walked down the corridor of the British Ministry and out into a London June that was warm and ordinary and full of people going about their lives, and he stood on the pavement and looked at the city for a moment. He had an appointment with Sirius in an hour. Grimmauld Place was, Sirius had informed him, 90% habitable, which by Sirius's definition meant structurally sound and free of the more aggressive portraits, with the kitchen functional and 3 bedrooms cleared and the rest of it ongoing. They were going to look at it together for the first time. Actually together, not through descriptions or letters but in person, the two of them walking through a house that was going to be home. He was looking forward to it. He was looking forward to September. To Hogwarts, to new things, to finding out what he was made of in a context that had nothing to do with being shaped for a purpose. He was curious about it the way he was curious about most things now, with the full, clean curiosity of someone who had nothing installed between themselves and the world. He pulled out his wand and did the small exercise he'd taken to doing when he had a moment to himself, not showing off, not practicing, just checking in, the way you might flex a hand to confirm it was still yours. The magic came easily, steady and clean and considerable, exactly as it always was now. He put the wand away. He thought about a prophecy, neither can live while the other survives, and he thought about what he'd said to Sirius on the terrace in France. That a prophecy told you the shape of an outcome, not the shape of the person who arrived at it. He thought about who would arrive at that outcome when the time came, not the function someone had designed, not the manageable piece of a plan, but the person who had been pushing back against 38 charms since the age of 1 and had never, not for a single day, been entirely erased. He thought, "Come on, then. Whenever you're ready." He thought it without heat, without bravado. Just the steady, grounded certainty of someone who knew exactly what they were and had stopped apologizing for the dimensions of it. The June sun was warm on his face. The city moved around him, ordinary and full. He had an hour before Sirius, and he decided to walk. He walked through London in the summer, past the phone boxes and the ordinary streets and the people who didn't know, and he thought about all of it, November to June, the 38-0, the person who had stood in a lift with the careful, flinching quality of someone inhabiting their own life as minimally as possible and the person walking now, who inhabited it completely, all the way to the edges. He thought about Fleur saying you were always going to be okay. He thought about Apolline going still in a doorway. He thought about Sirius's laugh by the geese and Gabrielle's drawing and Henry's ratatouille and dog, who was at Grimmauld Place right now, apparently, because Sirius had let her come to London in the specific way of a man who'd had no pets for 8 years and had immediately caved to the first animal that had asked. He thought, I have people. He thought, that's the thing. That's the most important thing, in the end. Not the power, not the tribunal, not the 38 charms and their documented consequences. The people. The ones who showed up and didn't leave. He stopped at a corner and waited for the light. The city moved. The light changed. He walked.